All right, I believe we are live now. Just make sure. Yes. It's my phone. So, thank you to all of you for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. It's my privilege to be here and do something that I haven't actually done before. So, we are doing a joint debate review, and I'm Dr. Khalil Andani. I'm an assistant professor of religion at Augustana College, and I hold a PhD in Islamic studies. So I'm an intellectual historian of Islamic thought. But recently, I have gotten into some philosophical theology in some of my side projects
Yeah.
and in this recent debate. And I have here Dr. Bo Branson, who I'm happy to call a friend. He has actually guest lectured in my classes before. And Dr. Branson is an associate professor of philosophy at Brescia University. Welcome,
Thank
Bo. How
you.
are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you again too. It'll be an interesting debate review, I think. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So we have a bunch of we have an audience. So I invite anyone who in the audience who's watching live. Feel free to pose a question in the chat. We'll try to get to it. So the way we're going to do this is let me just lay out the format of today. So first, each of us, starting with Bo and then myself, each of us is going to sort of summarize in 5 to 10 minutes the debate that they had with Jake Brancatella, the Muslim metaphysician. So both debates are going to be summarized by each of us. And then Bo and I decided to do this joint review because there are, 3 or 4 issues of cross fertilization
Hmm.
between these two debates. Although they seem like very different debates, the first debate is about uh, the notion of aseity and the divine nature. Involving the Trinity somewhat, and the second debate is about Tawhid. But we actually found when we corresponded after these debates that there was some overlap
Yeah.
theologically and philosophically. That's why we're doing this. So we're going to begin by summarizing the debates, each of us, and then we're going to focus on about 3 or 4 issues that we found overlap between the two debates. The first issue is the nature of the divine attributes in Sunni theology, including the Athari Creed that Jake affirms. So that's the first issue. What is the nature? What is the ontological status of divine attributes? And are they comparable to the persons of the Trinity? So that's issue number one. Issue number two uh, is the notion of Mysterianism. What counts as an appeal to mystery? Do Trinitarians appeal to mystery to justify their position? Do Atharis appeal to mystery? Do Ismailis appeal to mystery? So Bo is going to sort of lead that discussion for us. And then the third issue that we'll be looking at, which is a much more broader issue, is what do both of these debates tell us about what I like to call the neo Salafi or the neo Athari Dawa, the neo Salafi, neo Athari missionary movement of Muslims that takes place online? Because these debates are quite revealing in terms of what neo Salafis say to non Muslims, whether in debates or in speaker corners, and what neo Salafis or neo Atharis preach among Muslims themselves. There seems to be an inconsistency. So we'll also talk about that broader issue. So with that, I would like to invite Bo, if you would like to give us your 5 to 10 minute summary, critical summary of the debate that you had, and let me know if you want to share any slides.
Yeah. I'm just looking to see how to share my slides. Let's see. Does that work? Looks like
Yep.
not. Oh, it did. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, um, I guess I can just control it from here. So, yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible. As I've already done a debate review on my own, so um, you can find that floating around on the internet somewhere. But briefly, we debated, Jake and I debated this proposition. It's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity, or I put absolute aseity in parentheses. So I've called that proposition the Eunomian premise, because it was used by this heretical bishop Eunomius of Cyzicus in the 4th century to argue against the traditional doctrine of the Trinity. And roughly that view says, you have the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the Son of God is going to be like an exact carbon copy of God, just like a duplicate of God. He's going to be like him in every way, except for the fact that God is from no one. The Father, that is from no one, and the Son is from the Father. So there's some sense of generation. We call it begetting. And same with the Holy Spirit. We say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. So the Son and the Spirit are from the Father, but he's not from anyone else. A nature is like an intrinsic principle of action or activity. Usually that's identified following Aristotle with a thing's essence or quiddity. We can talk about that if it's interesting to anyone. And I just put those terms. Ase is just a Latin phrase. It means from yourself, and ab alio, from another. So the idea is it's sort of God the Father is ase, but the Son and Spirit are ab alio. They're from the Father. So obviously, if the Eunomian premise is true, then that doctrine is going to be incoherent, right? If you can't have the divine nature without also being ase, then this view would just be incoherent. So Jake took the affirmative position. He wanted to argue that it is true, and I took the negative and said it's not true. So he gave 3 arguments. He called the nature of natures argument. I think he called this the father cow, or the ase cow argument, and then the contingency of the father argument. So briefly, the nature of natures argument said that if the Father can beget the Son, but the Son doesn't beget another divine person, and that person doesn't beget another divine person, and so on, then they don't really have the same causal powers. They don't really have the same nature. And my response to that was just, it kind of misunderstands the Aristotelian metaphysics of nature. So not all powers have to be grounded in a nature. You just postulate a nature essentially when you have emergent properties that aren't attributable to anything more basic. So then you get this nature. So in our system, the ability of the Father to beget a Son is what we call his hypostatic property. It's what makes him the individual that he is, and not the kind of thing that he is. And so I argued that it's a misunderstanding of the metaphysics. And I'll kind of move through these quickly. The ase cow argument, he basically said that if aseity isn't necessitated by the divine nature, then the opposite, being ab alio, can't be necessitated by a non-divine nature. And so then you could have non-divine things that would not be ab alio, they'd be ase. So for example, you could have an ase cow. And my response to that was, that's a formal logical fallacy. It's fairly common among students and people that aren't very well trained in logic. It's what we call inferring the logical converse, or you might sometimes see closely related fallacies, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. Basically, it's saying if A, then B, therefore if B, then A. And that's generally not valid. So a few examples. If I cut your head off, you'll die. That's true, but it's not true that if you die, I must have cut your head off, because there's other ways you could die, right? Or if X is a cow, X is an animal. It doesn't follow that if something's an animal, then it has to be a cow, because there's other ways to be an animal. So in general, if A, then B doesn't entail if B, then A. So that just wasn't a valid argument. Basically, what Jake wanted to do is say, I'll admit, right, if X is non-divine, then it's ab alio. So if it's a cow, right, it's ab alio. And then he wanted to infer from that if it's ab alio, it has to be non-divine. So if it's ab alio like the Son and the Spirit, it has to be non-divine. But that's just not a formally valid argument. And then the last thing that argument that he gave, I'm still trying to get to the bottom of this, but the contingency of the Father argument, basically he said that in some definitions of the terms intrinsic and extrinsic that are given by David Lewis and Ray Langton in a paper of theirs, and I referenced this paper in a video that I did about a year ago, and he said that those definitions have this result that either there's no intrinsic properties at all, or everything has to be a contingent being. Like they didn't really consider the possibility of something like God or other things being necessarily existent. And my response to that was I just agreed to it because there wasn't any clear connection, that there's not really any clear way to get from, that definition is flawed to it's impossible to have the divine nature without aseity. I didn't use those definitions during our debate. They're not really essential to my overall position, so I just sort of granted it. And I also said, you can make a kind of slight emendation to their definitions that seems to get around that problem, and he never really responded to that emendation. Though he still seems pretty sore about this. I think to me, this seemed like the worst argument that he gave because there wasn't any obvious connection, but he seems to think it was, I don't know, really pretty good somehow. So those were his arguments and my responses. I gave two arguments. Basically, I just, at first anyway, in my opening statement, I said, Eunomius's original arguments relied on absolute divine simplicity, which you, Khalil, would actually affirm. So you'd actually be able to use Eunomius's arguments in a consistent way, but Jake rejects absolute divine simplicity, so he can't use Eunomius's original argument. And I gave an inductive argument. I said, for the last 1600 years or so, anti-Trinitarians have had a motive to want to try to develop an argument for this claim that you can't have the divine nature without aseity, but they haven't succeeded in doing that. It pops up every so often in the history of the debate, but usually it's just kind of asserted without any argument. And I just said inductively, it seems like the longer you go without being able to find an argument, the more likely it seems to be that there's just not one. And finally, I gave some kind of a priori arguments that, just to kind of cut it short, I just pointed out that the Eunomian premise is what we call a synthetic a priori proposition. So it's this claim about metaphysics that is not true by definition, and it's also not supposed to be based on experience. And it's always kind of a mystery, like how do you justify those? But a few ways you can do it are, one, you can argue that a certain metaphysical claim like this maybe solves certain puzzles, so it's kind of useful philosophically. That's a way to argue for them. Another way is to show that it just logically follows from other synthetic a priori principles that the person you're arguing with believes in and accepts. And I kind of predicted that Jake wouldn't be able to do either of those, and he didn't. He didn't show that it solved any puzzles, and he didn't show that it followed logically from anything else. And that was all kind of, that's our debate. But where it got sort of interesting and started to, I think, intersect with stuff that happened in the debate with you, Khalil, later on, was in the cross-examination. I asked him a series of questions to try to get at a couple of issues. So one, with respect to qualities that you might ordinarily associate with the divine essence, so things like being omniscient and omnipotent and omnibenevolent and so forth, I asked if there's any reason basically to think that those would conflict with being ab alio. Like, could God, if he wanted to, just generate, an angel or something that's ab alio but is omniscient? Could he generate something that's got a perfect will and so forth? And there didn't seem to be any conflict there. And then the second thing where it really overlaps with Khalil's debate is with respect to the ways, not just these kind of omni qualities, but the ways in which God exists. So the fact that God is eternal, he exists in all possible worlds, he's not created or brought into being out of non-being. Are those things compatible with being ab alio? And so specifically there, I asked Jake about his view on God's so-called hands, which interestingly, in my debate with him, I asked him, do you take these to be like literal hands, or are they just like attributes, or what? And he just said they're attributes. Like there was no, there was nothing else. Just they're just attributes. Which seemed like he took a little different position in the debate with you, but we can get to that. But he affirmed all of this about the hands/attributes. So they exist in all possible worlds, so they're necessarily existent. They exist at all times, so they're eternal. And so since they do exist at all times, they're not created. They're not brought into being out of non-being. They're not created in that sense. But then he also said they're not identical to God himself, right? So these are some, they're not just the same thing as God, and not just different ways of talking about God. But then he said they're not absolutely se. They're ab alio because they, in some sense, depend upon God for their existence. And so, we'll talk about this more later, but there's some obvious parallels there then, because that's what we say about the Son and the Holy Spirit. They're necessary, they're eternal, they're not brought into being out of non-being. They're not identical to God, but they're ab alio, they're from God the Father. And we'll talk about, ways that he maybe thought you could make distinctions and whether there are any. But my goal in all that was just kind of to point out that by his own admission, all of the things that the traditional doctrine of the Trinity associates with God's nature seem to be individually compatible with being ab alio. So it kind of raises the question, why can't the whole big package be compatible with being ab alio altogether? And what I noticed in the debate with Khalil is that he seemed to take different positions on some of these issues. So we'll get into that. I can stop my screen there, but that's just kind of very briefly. Let's see. How do I stop sharing? There we go. You can stop it. So that's hopefully I didn't take up too much time, but that's briefly our debate and where it started to seem to overlap with yours.
Well, thank you so much for that. And again, for people who don't know, Bo has done a detailed review of his debate. I think it was, I don't know how long it was, but it was very detailed.
Yeah.
And that's on the Orthodox Shahada channel. So I don't know if somebody wants to post it in the chat. But for
So
viewers interested
in more detail, you can.
Yeah. So for viewers interested in an actual debate review just on that debate, you can go to that channel.
Yeah.
I haven't done a detailed debate review. I did more like an interview with the Catholic Reason and Theology, more like a post-debate, post-debate impressions session I did with them. I have not actually done a detailed review, so this is the first time I'm sort of being more analytical about it. But thank you for sharing that. So we will come back to some of what Bo touched on when we do our sort of joint stuff. I'm going to now give a sort of summary from my perspective of the debate that I had with Jake Brancatella. So I said this in the debate, and just so everybody knows, okay, I first encountered Jake Brancatella in I believe it was 2020. Shortly after he appeared on Mufti Abu Laith's Mind Trap podcast. And I sent Jake some complimentary messages because I appreciated what he was doing. And we had a very positive relationship in 2020 and 2021. But by the end of 2021, for various reasons, but mostly because of the ramping up of Salafi anti-Shia polemic on certain social media circles, there was a campaign to cancel me from the show Blogging Theology. I was interviewed on Blogging Theology to talk about a Quranic studies topic, and after my appearance, the Salafis and the neo-Salafis mounted a campaign to cancel me from the show, and they succeeded for about 1 week. They actually tried all sorts of underhanded tactics, intimidation against the host of Blogging Theology. And to his credit, Paul Williams, who's a very sort of discerning and reflective person, thought about the whole issue, and he decided that academic freedom is what his show wanted to promote. So he reinstated my episode. He did not submit to the intimidation tactics of the Salafi lobby, and my episode went back up the week of December 10th. Now, what happened that week then is, in reaction to the Salafis failing to cancel me from blogging theology, they did about 5 days of anti-Shia, anti-Ismaili, and anti-me rooms on Clubhouse. And the first of those rooms, at least that week, was led by Jake Brancatella, called Ismaili Kufr and Neoplatonism. So I responded to this Clubhouse room that Jake did. This is actually like what Jake posted on his Facebook, by the way. You can see his profile right there. So I responded to this on Twitter, and I called, and my tweets are still there. And I said, look, Mr. Jake Brancatella, he's saying all these things about Islamic Neoplatonism and this being kufr, unbelief. And I simply said, look, this is a person who lacks both academic credentials in Islamic studies and lacks traditional, Sunni ijazat certifications. So there isn't a lot of credibility behind the things he says, and he got very offended by me calling out his absolute lack of qualifications to talk about these topics. And in response to my response, Jake challenged me to a debate, like on Twitter. Of course, he blocked me, so I couldn't reply. And eventually, we agreed to have a debate. And that's why I did this debate. Otherwise, I don't really do debates. I do dialogues, and maybe on another occasion, Bo, we could do a sort of, I think they call it a theolocution now, when two people with different worldviews just lay it out, not to defeat each other, but to sort of, I'm happy to do maybe in the future something like that with you or whoever it is, from any worldview. That's what I'm more interested in. I don't care about defeating people, but this is what happened. So I accepted that debate. And our debate was about Tawhid. All right. That was the agreed topic. It's about debating Tawhid. And I told Jake, because initially what Jake wanted to do, and this is all in the private messages that I have with him, although he's trying to remove my access to Facebook Messenger with him as well. But in private messages, Jake initially wanted to only debate whether Ismaili Neoplatonism was Islamic or not. And I said, look, if you want to debate me publicly, you will pick a Sunni position and I will pick my Neoplatonic position. So he agreed to that, and he picked the Athari Creed, Athari Hanbali Creed. So in Islam, people don't know this, although we verbally all subscribe to the same doctrine of divine unity called Tawhid. There are different formulations of what Tawhid actually means among Muslims. Okay, there's a whole lot. Okay, there's probably like a dozen, at least 12 different conceptions of Tawhid, if not more, over the past 1,000 years. So the Tawhid that I was defending was an Ismaili Neoplatonic model, and this is what it is. It is one God who is absolutely simple, who has no parts of any kind. So this is absolute divine simplicity. And then this one God, in my worldview, eternally originates the first intellect, which is an incorporeal, eternal creation of God. It is a self-thinking intellect, so we call it the first intellect. And its self-thinking produces what others call the ideas or the archetypes of everything, the forms. So it's also called the pen. And then this first intellect is the intermediary cause for other divine creations, such as the universal soul and eventually the cosmos. So this is like the Islamic Neoplatonic model. And this model that you see on my screen is particular to the Ismailis, okay? Because there are other Neoplatonists in Islam who may have 10 intellects or 11 intellects or some crazy number. The Ismailis have the simplest model. You have God, you have the first intellect, which is the first creation, you have the universal soul, which is the second creation, and then you have the world of souls and bodies, right? So this is an Ismaili model that I was defending. But what Jake and I had agreed to is that we didn't want people to look at the debate as the Sunni community versus the Shia community, right? We didn't want the debate to arise sectarian sort of tensions or issues of representation. So we agreed that although I'm defending Ismaili positions, which is based on the text that I gave Jake, my side would be called Islamic philosophy. He was allowed to name his side, and I was allowed to name my side. So I took the title Islamic philosophy because I don't speak for the Ismaili community as a whole. I'm just a member of the Ismaili community who has certain philosophical and theological views like anybody else, right? And similarly, Jake didn't want to be the one speaking for all Sunnis, so he named his thing Aseity Creed, and I named my position Islamic philosophy. But it was agreed between the two of us where our positions were coming from, what texts they're based on. Now, Jake's position, as far as I can get from the books he gave me, and there's a reason why there's a strikeout over here. Jake gave me two books to get his creed from, two Hanbali books, Ibn Qudama and Ibn Hamdan. So I read those books, and the creed that Jake defends, or supposed to defend, according to his view of Tawhid, is that basically the one God is a metaphysical composite. And God is a composite of a divine essence, which you can say nothing about directly, and multiple real distinct attributes, which I've represented here. And by real distinct, these attributes, God's knowledge, God's power, God's speech, these are concrete entitative realities. Right. So in Arabic, they're called sifat mahnawiya. So mahnawi here means that these are concrete entities. They're not abstract objects. So in the Athari or the Salafi view that Jake is defending, God has these sort of attributes like will, power, knowledge, and life, which are not identical to one another. They're not identical to God's essence. And God also has these, what you could call anthropomorphic, seemingly anthropomorphic attributes, right? So many of them will say that God really has two fingers, God has two hands, God has 2 feet, and then there'll be a debate on, well, what do these things really mean? But these are also attributes in some sense.
Does that say few eyes?
Yes, because the hadith used says God is not one-eyed, so it's open how many eyes he could have.
So more than one. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so sometimes a number is given, like a hadith says 2 fingers or 2 hands, and sometimes it just says, well, he's not, our Lord is not one-eyed. So this is the creed that the Athari, Hanbali, Salafi position, and I'm conflating them right now for a reason, because Jake promised to defend Athari Tawhid, but he ended up defending Salafi Tawhid in the debate, which I'll get to. So these are the contrasts between our positions, right? My Tawhid is a Tawhid of divine simplicity with a single act of eternal creation. And through that act of creation, reality unfolds hierarchically from simpler, higher, more perfect to more complex, less perfect reality. That is the Neoplatonic position that the Ismailis believe in and many other Muslims believe in. And the Athari position is this composite God with real distinct entitative attributes, some of which are seemingly anthropomorphic. And it's also a position of occasionalism, which we didn't get into in the debate, but the text that Jake gave me to read are occasionalist texts, i.e. God creates every single change that happens in the cosmos, and creatures have no causal power. So these are the contrasts, and I was arguing for my side, and he was supposed to argue for his side. Now, again, I committed to defending Ismaili Neoplatonism, okay? And I'll show you how I did that. But it is a fact that the broader Neoplatonic model that you see on the slide here, absolutely simple God, eternal first intellect, some other intermediaries, and then the world. This broader Neoplatonic model is quite widespread. And this is a point that I was making early on in my debate opening. And it hasn't, because I was just making the point that Neoplatonism, or what we call hikmah in the tradition, because this is widespread, it is now being claimed incorrectly that for the debate, I was supposed to defend every single Islamic Neoplatonist under the sun at the same time. This is what
Yeah.
Jake is claiming. He's still claiming it, and he's saying, "Oh, you have a logical problem." We'll get to that, but no, that is not what I committed to defend. And let me just show our audience.
In the point that it's a common view.
Yes, yes. So these are private messages between myself and Jake Brancatella on Facebook prior to the debate. Okay. You can see here on December 12th, 2021, the blue is my text. I give Jake two books, two primary books that I'm going to get my position from. These are both the Smiley books. So two authors, two books. Now, I have no problem if he would have read other books by the same author. To me, that's totally fair game. Um, so that's what I was, and I reiterated that at other times. I'm going based on these two texts. So my position is coming from these two authors, Nasser de Khosrow and Abu Yaqub Sijistani. Both are Ismailis, right? And Jake even said to me, and you can see it on this side, the source of this debate is the Quran, the two respective books, and rational argumentation. Okay, so it's supposed to be based on the two books. And I would allow Jake, for my case, to look at other books by the same authors. I would have no problem if he did that. And he's telling me that his position is coming from the two books that he gave me, which are Ibn Qudama and Ibn Hamdan. And Jake is telling me that I'm not allowed to quote Ibn Taymiyyah, and that he won't be quoting somebody outside my two authors. So these are the terms of the debate. So if Jake comes now, he's made about 15 posts and 7 videos about me in the last month. If he comes and says that I was supposed to defend Ibn Sina, this is completely wrong. He should produce a private message where I tell him I'm going to defend Ibn Sina and every single, Neoplatonist under the sun. So now let's go to the debate itself. The first thing I would know, and I'm not going to analyze the whole debate, I just picked out a few things. So what we have here is a slide from Jake's opening statement where he lays out the position of the Aseity Creed that he's supposed to defend. Now, a couple things. Number one, for what he's given on the slide, Jake offered 0 positive arguments for the truth of his position. He gave us no reason why the Aseity Creed or the Salafi version of the Aseity Creed is the correct position over any other position in the history of Islamic thought. So that's one thing to note. And his defense was simply, well, we just follow what the texts of the Quran and Sunnah say, and that's it. So this was even noted by people on Discord. So you even have here somebody who watched the debate. 1 hour, 30 minutes has passed, and Jake still hasn't responded to Dr. Andani's challenge. Make a positive case for the Aseity model of God. So this is what I would call just special pleading. Jake seemed to think that he could just come into the debate, attack, and if the opponent's position is defeated, the default view just becomes Aseity Creed, and I just don't see how that would follow. But there's another thing I noticed. In the debate, Jake grounded his epistemology, what you see on the screen. Jake grounded his approach in a certain way that seems to conflict with what he has said in other interviews within the last 3 months. So I'm going to actually show something here. I'm going to play a clip or a series of clips on this point. So I'm going to show you a clip here where we're going to see what Jake says about how he assesses whether something is true from a religious perspective when it comes to Christian beliefs. And then you're going to see that in the debate with me, he says something different when it comes to Islamic beliefs. I have a background in philosophy. So let's just begin. I don't know if this is audible. I think it is. So let's just begin. So this is from an interview he gave on the Three Muslims podcast 3 months ago. And here's what he says about why, how he talks about the Trinity with Trinitarians.
I have a background in philosophy, so I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I'm trained specifically in analytic philosophy. When I speak to Trinitarians or people that believe Jesus is God, I say, listen, I'll grant you for the sake of argument that Jesus is God, or that the Bible teaches that Jesus is God. Let's say the Bible's reliable and the Bible teaches that Jesus is God and he's the second member of the Trinity, right? Even if I believed it was true and I'm granting it for the sake of argument, I still wouldn't believe in the Trinity. So an example I give is I say, even if it said in bold letters on every page of the Bible that Jesus is God or the Trinity is true, I still wouldn't believe in it because it just doesn't make any sense. And so that's kind of my approach.
All right. So note what he said, right? At least this is what I heard. He said,
Judaist. Well, I guess it's a very just like it has to make rational sense to me, or even if it is a divine revelation, if it doesn't make sense to me, it's out.
That's what I heard too. He said, if the Bible is true, even if it said Jesus is God and the Trinity is true, Jake would not accept it because
that can be a legit revelation, but you should reject it if it doesn't make rational sense.
Correct. That's what. So it's basically reason adjudicates over the text of Revelation.
Yeah.
Basically. Okay. So that was 3 months ago. What did he say in the debate with me?
We affirm what the Quran and Sunnah affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we do not attempt to go further. We do not seek to use alien philosophies and metaphysical notions that are not derived from the text in order to derive our interpretations of the text itself.
All right, so pause there. So now he's saying we just follow what the Quran and Sunnah say, which are texts.
Right.
Both of these are scriptures for Sunnis.
Yeah.
And no alien philosophy allowed.
Yeah, so there it
no
sounds just
metaphysics
like,
allowed.
Yeah, so the revelation takes precedence over rational thought and philosophy. It's interesting to me because I mean exactly what he's saying there is exactly what I would imagine. Well, what a lot of Christians do say that they'll say, "Oh, you're bringing in philosophy, and that's that's this pagan external thing that you're importing," and it's.
So that's interesting because he says we go by the text of the Quran and the Sunnah, and we don't go past them. No alien philosophy. But then he said also 3 months ago. Just load up here.
And I'm trained specifically in analytic philosophy.
So wait, analytic philosophy is allowed or it's not allowed?
Yeah, that's not a foreign import. That's a native Islamic constraint.
I mean, Bo, how old is analytic philosophy and who came up with that?
Maybe 100.
Were Muslims doing analytic philosophy in the 800s? The Hadith narrators, were they doing analytic philosophy?
I'm pretty sure Bertrand Russell was a Muslim from the 800s or whatever. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's what I don't. It's a kind of contradiction I see with some Christian philosophy too. It's like, oh, pagan Greek philosophy is bad or something, but then it's like, oh, the contemporary philosophy that I've imbibed is totally neutral of any cultural or historical biases or anything like that. But
yeah. All right, let's keep going.
This is primarily because we are certain in our belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists and that he has sent the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam with the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet, which is obligatory to affirm and to follow. We have no doubt about the truthfulness of the guidance that has reached us, and so we accept it as it comes.
Let's say
all right, so he just said, right, we believe the Quran and Sunnah. Why do we believe it? Because we know they're true.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you the premise seems to be, if it's a true revelation, then we accept it as it comes. Those are his words. We accept it as it comes. All right. So then, obviously, one should apply that standard to anything you regard as a true revelation, right? Well, let's see. Is he consistent?
Let's say the Bible's reliable and the Bible teaches that Jesus is God and he's the second member of the Trinity, right?
Okay, so then he ought to accept anything the Bible teaches being true if the Bible is true.
Yeah, if you admit that, then
sake of argument, I still wouldn't believe in the Trinity. So,
okay,
yeah.
So now it's different though. If it doesn't make sense, Jake would reject it. Okay, so obviously he would apply the make sense standard to the Quran and Sunnah texts as well, right?
You would think.
We believe Allah when he states in the Quran that he created Adam alayhi salam with his own hands and that he is above the throne. However, this does not mean that we believe Allah has physical limbs, nor do we say that he is encompassed by space. We affirm these texts on their apparent meanings and that it is obligatory to believe in them.
Let's say the Bible's reliable and the Bible teaches that Jesus is God and he's the second member of the Trinity, right? Even if it said in bold letters on every page of the Bible that Jesus is God or the Trinity is true, I still wouldn't believe in it because it just doesn't make any sense. And so that's kind of my approach or where I'm coming from.
We believe Allah when he states in the Quran that he created Adam alayhi salam with his own hands and that he is above the throne.
So look, I don't find any consistency here, right? Bible says something.
Yeah.
Trinity, he doesn't think it makes sense, right?
It seems like a double standard. It seems just like, so with the Bible, it's going to be the Bible has to live up to my reasoning faculties. But with the Quran and the Sunnah, I'm just going to set those reasoning faculties aside and just kind of believe whatever it says. And with the apparent, and we'll get to this later too, but the apparent meaning of hand is that it's a physical body part, and he left that mysterious. We'll talk later about Mysterianism, but I think it ends up being I think the same approach that a lot of Christians take if you challenge them about the rationality of the Trinity. And
so I just wanted to point that out to begin, that the epistemic orientation that Jake seems to display in the debate with me violates what he has articulated on other occasions, especially when he's dealing with Trinitarians. Now, there's a further issue that I should point out in the debate with me. Before the debate, Jake said he was taking the Hanbali Athari creed as his position.
Mm-hmm.
And the characteristic element of a Hanbali Athari position is they do something called Tawhid al-Mahna. What that means is that when they encounter these mentions of God's hands, face coming down or whatever, they don't interpret these words. They sort of refuse to interpret these words. So they would say, God has something called yad, and we don't know what that means. Only God knows what it means. And that's called Tawhid al-Mahna. Now, that is the Hanbali Athari position. But in the debate, if you see the slide here, Jake didn't take this Tawhid position. He instead says, we affirm the apparent meaning of God creating with the hand or God being above the throne. We just heard that. And affirming the apparent meaning of these anthropomorphic descriptions of God is not the Hanbali Athari creed anymore, at least how it's understood today. That is instead what I would call the Salafi Athari creed. And the Salafis are a distinct theological camp from today's Hanbali Atharis. So Jake, I'm sorry to say that this may come across a bit harsh, but there's no other way to say it. Jake Brancatella violated the debate parameters that he had agreed to with me, because he changed his position from Hanbali Athari to Salafi Athari without actually informing me. And that's why I had come prepared. At least one of my arguments was against Tawhid. And Jake was like, I don't even believe this. Yeah, that's because you changed your position. Now, that's fine, but you had to tell me. This, of course, backfired on him, because here you have him telling me Feb 4, 2022, Jake says that he affirms Tawhid. I asked him, do you do Tawhid al-Mahna or Tawhid al-Kayf only, which we don't know how, but we affirm the meaning. And he says he does both. Okay, but then the position you took is you don't, in the debate, we're not doing both. Now that's fine, but you didn't tell me, so that's a violation of the debate agreement. But that also sunk Jake in the eyes of the audience, because traditional Sunni Muslims of the Hanbali, Ash'ari, Maturidi orientations, they all disagree with the Salafi Athari creed of affirming the apparent meaning. They find this offensive. So you had individuals on Twitter, many people on Twitter, saying Jake does not represent Sunni Islam. You have this account here, a Sunni account. Jake is a Salafi. They do not represent Sunni Islam. They are a cult with weird beliefs. So I need to make this very clear that in the views of non-Salafi Sunnis, the Salafi creed does not represent Sunni Islam. Many consider it to be heretical because it ends up affirming positions that ascribe physical, temporal, created qualities to God. Now, someone's saying in the chat, traditional Hanbalis do not do Tawhid al-Mahna. Your co-host is lying to you. Look, Mr. Study with Kither, I would say this. I think academically, we did have early Hanbalis who affirmed the apparent meaning. As an academic, I would say that. But today, the Hanbali Atharis of today, people who follow the views of Sheikh Yusuf bin Sadiq, for example, today's Hanbali Atharis do not affirm the apparent meaning. They do Tawhid al-Mahna. And even Ibn Qudama, based on how he's read today by current Hanbalis, Ibn Qudama is seen to be someone who does Tawhid al-Mahna. So that is the problem. And the Salafis, being people who affirm the apparent meaning, are actually the outliers of today. I will grant you that if we go back to the 800s and 900s, you will probably find early Hanbalis who don't do Tawhid. I will grant that. But in terms of what the creed is today and in the post-classical period, the lines are very clear. The Salafi position is X and the Hanbali Athari position is Y. All right, let's keep going then. So again, I'll just remind people, Jake offered no argument, no positive case was made for his Salafi Athari position at all. And in my mind, this is when he lost the debate. So after as he did his opening statement, I actually told some of my friends, I was like, did he just not even give an argument? And they were like, yeah. I was like, did I miss something? And my friends were like, no, you didn't miss anything. He didn't give an argument. And at that point, we knew the debate was finished. And I honestly, I've never done a debate before, but after Jake's opening statement, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was thinking this is going to be a walk in the park. And, you know, according to many viewers, it was a walk in the park. All right, let's continue. So what Jake did try to do during the debate is he made offensive arguments, right? He just tried to attack me personally and attack my position. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'll just simply say that everything Jake said in his attack was answered by me in the debate itself. So unlike another person who is taking about a month to actually respond and rebut things from the debate, I rebutted every claim he made in the debate, and I've just given the reference to people here. I don't want to rehash the whole thing. We will talk about number one, Bo and I, in a bit. I just want to show just one example. I'm just going to look at argument 3 to answer something, a charge that has been made recently. So if I were asked, how would you characterize Jake's arguments? I would say, with all respect to undergrads, because I teach undergrads, but in general, I felt that Jake's argumentation displayed a great deal of undergraduate mistakes. And the way he argued resembled someone who takes a course with me and crams for the exam a night before, doesn't do the full reading, and just picks out a few passages from the textbook and tries to bluff their way through the exam based on that. That's the impression I got. So let me just show you an example of what I would call an undergraduate mistake. So his argument 3A, we can call it. Jake said that Khalil Andani cannot prove or demonstrate that God exists because Ismaili theology never did so. And to support this claim, Jake relied on a secondary book chapter, not even a peer-reviewed journal article, but a book chapter by Wilfred Madelung. Now, this description that we read here, Madelung did say this. This is true. However, this was in 1977. And academic conclusions change over time as more data becomes available. That's just how academia works. Mm-hmm. So this particular statement from the article turns out to be incorrect in actual fact. Yes, Jake said in one of his videos that I quoted this 1977 article, or I put it in one of my bibliographies in an article I wrote a couple of years ago. Therefore, I am now committed to endorsing the article and everything it says. No, this is not the way citation works. Look, Jake, I'm sure you would have learned this in your BA philosophy program, but maybe you are not required to write essays. But when people have to write an essay, whether you're an undergrad, whether you're an MA student, whether you're a PhD candidate, or whether you're somebody like me, an assistant professor, or whether you're an associate professor like Bo, when you write on a topic, you must cite either directly or footnotes. You must cite all the literature on that topic, even if you don't agree with it at all. It is a sort of way of acknowledging the shoulders of the academic scholars that we stand on.
Yeah, so I was going to say he did a whole. Sorry, I don't know if I should save this for later or not, but yeah, he did a whole. I don't know, hour and a half or something on some debate review that I watched talking about this, and it just seems like it's just a misunderstanding of how citations work. So I'll just say, yeah, like I cite people all the time that I don't agree with, and yeah, for one thing, because you don't want to plagiarize. You have to say what your sources are. You want to help other scholars say, well, I've already done the research here. You can track this down, or like, here's where I'm getting this information. And then they'll cite if they're getting it somewhere. So there's all sorts of scholarly reasons why we have citations. And it doesn't mean that you think this person is the Pope and they can't possibly be wrong about anything. Like, even when you cite someone who you're citing them because you agree with them, it doesn't always mean you agree 100% with everything, right? Like, if I cite someone, here's this argument. I mean, I guess I agree with their conclusion, and you should read their argument for further information, but it doesn't necessarily mean I believe 100% of what they say. It's just not the point of a citation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the citation is actually a sort of a political thing. You have to cite certain people, even if you don't agree with them, even if you're about to overturn their finding, you have to cite them and you have to put them in your bibliography. So when Jake made a whole video and he accused, and the reason why I'm responding to this is that the recent sort of set of videos that Jake made, I have no problem if he wants to attack arguments and dispute, arguments and facts. That's fine. But there have been accusations against me of academic dishonesty, of taqiyya, say I do taqiyya, which, by the way, is an Islamophobic trope. And it's ironic that Jake, a Muslim convert, would pick up an Islamophobic trope that's technically used against Muslims in America and use it against me. So these accusations have been made, and I think that because a lot of people online eat these things up, I want to set the record straight. But I want to I said in the debate that we have Ismaili primary sources where Ismailis do prove or demonstrate that God exists. I said that, and that is an academic claim. So I just want to give a couple of examples. So here we have a text by Hamid ad-Din Kermani, who died around the year 1021. He was probably the highest ranking Ismaili Dai of his time, worked directly with the Ismaili Imam of the time, Imam al-Hakim. And this is from a text called Rahat al-Aql. Now notice this text is edited in 1983, which is after 1977. And I've just taken a few passages out of this text around page 130, 129, 130. And here, for those who can read Arabic, what Kermani is doing is he's offering a cosmological argument for God. And again, I know, Bo, you can't read this, but what he's basically saying is he's saying that, look, it's among the foundational principles that some existing things depend on other existing things. So he cites the cosmological reality of dependence, of ontological dependence. And then he goes further and he says, that upon which all dependent existence terminate is God. And he says that right here.
Yeah.
Right. So he's
Which
making
makes sense, because the cosmological argument or something like it has been the foundation of, a lot of Christian arguments and Islamic arguments for forever. It's one of the central, arguments. So it makes sense. It's not surprising to me that you would find an Ismaili giving the cosmological argument.
Yeah. So, and this is an interesting argument because it's not a cause argument. He doesn't argue God as a first cause. He's trying, because in Ismaili parlance, we don't like to call God a cause. We think he's sort of a causer. He's the causer of the causes. So it's a very interesting argument, which I'm going to be writing on. I think it prefigures some of the modern day arguments of conditioned and unconditioned realities. But it is a cosmological argument. It's not a sort of assertion or a special pleading. So you have an Ismaili text making an argument for God. So that means what Jake said is just false. It's just empirically false. Now, look, this is an Arabic text. It's not translated. You could find the PDF online. And Jake does not read in the sense of understand Arabic or Persian primary sources. So maybe he couldn't have been blamed for this undergraduate mistake. However, we have another text of Kermani, which has been translated. So the translation is called Master of the Age. And in this text, which is in English, which you can buy and probably find it online too, Kermani gives 7 arguments for the existence of God. And he says at the beginning, it behooves us to put in first position the argument that proves the maker, on whose existence depends the existence of all. And he goes on to say that the way to prove God, follows the setting up of demonstrations consisting of both sensation and intellection as applied to the product of his making. Right. So he's basically saying we're going to use cosmological arguments to prove God. So this text is translated, and Jake could have read this text, and he would have read this, and he would not have made this, undergraduate error. So that's just one example I wanted to show. So yes, Ismailis do make arguments for God. Now, let's say, though, by 1100, Ismailis had not yet made arguments for God, right? Let's say empirically they had never done it. It would not follow that Ismailis can't make arguments for God, right? That's a whole other thing. But they do make arguments for God. Now, the second thing that Jake said, this was sort of like argument 3B, he quoted a secondary source which said, you can't say anything about God. It's better to keep silent. And Jake said, so Ismailis have to keep silent. They can't talk about God. I would simply point out that the fact that Jake made this argument in an opening statement where he's citing multiple Ismaili sources that do talk about God sort of, makes his argument self-refuting. You can't say I've quoted all these primary Ismaili sources, but then say Ismailis are not allowed to talk about God, because they obviously are talking about God in all these books that you were proudly citing. But furthermore, the argument itself is incorrect. Because the Ismaili position is not that you cannot say anything about God, it's that you have to speak about God correctly. And again, I'll go back to the text of Hamiduddin Kermani that I quoted earlier, the Rahat al-Aql. These are just chapter headings, okay? These are just like chapter headings in that text. And what you get here is, according to Kermani, God cannot be described through an attribute, right? God is not a body. He's not an intellect. These are rough translations, by the way. I'm just sort of give you the gist of the translation. So God cannot be talked about using an attribute that belongs to created things. That is the Ismaili position. Yet you can talk about what God is not. So God is not a body. He has no contrary. He has no likeness. And then Kermani says in his book, the truest speech with respect to Tawhid, praise, glorification, and affirmation, talking about God, is the method of negating from him all the attributes that exist within existence. So clearly you can talk about God. Like it actually says the word goal here, which means speech. So this argument 3b that Jake made is just incorrect, like factually incorrect. And again, it's something I expect an undergraduate, it's a mistake that an undergraduate could make because they don't have access to primary sources. So that's
also a mistake that analytic philosophers make. So analytic philosophers have a hard time with apophatic theology. But my feeling about that has always been that it's just based on a shallow understanding of what apophatic theology is supposed to be. Like apophaticism doesn't really say you literally can't say anything about God, which that would be contradictory. If you said about God, you can't say anything about God. Okay, well but that's not the idea. The idea is that all of these sort of created attributes are not to be directly attributed to God, which, I mean, that's not, I mean, maybe you could find an incoherence with that, but it's not just immediately contradictory,
Yeah, I've noticed that analytic theologians attack apophatic theology, but they mistake two types of speech. There's a speech about God, which Plotinus says we go around the one, and then there's a speech of God, right? That actually supposedly like reveals like the
you're predicating something
content
of God.
Yeah,
it's funny that the exact same sort of phrase comes up in a lot of church fathers. They will say we can talk about the things around the essence or about the essence, but you don't know the essence of God itself. But people ignore that, they just kind of act like it's this all out, you just can't talk about God, which that's not the view.
So as for my part of the debate, and I'm not going to rehash any of this, but everybody knows, I think, sort of going around now, this is the report card. So I offered 10 arguments for the truth of my position and the falsity of Jake's position in the debate. Now, look, people said, oh, this is not fair. It's a machine gun approach. It's not a machine gun approach, because if you look at my arguments very carefully, arguments 3, 4, and 5 are sort of linked up. If you look, they're all about the same problem. They're all about Tawhid, So, and then some of these other arguments are linked. So, for example, the idea that God has only one direct creation, it follows from divine simplicity. So Jake didn't even have to refute the argument for the first intellect if he simply refuted divine simplicity, and so on. So one could group these things together and answer them. But here's the thing. Jake made 4 arguments in the debate. I rebutted all 4 of his arguments. So Jake clearly had time to rebut at least 4 of my arguments. But in the debate, he couldn't even rebut 1 of my arguments. So I think that, these 10 arguments, I formulated them. They had, different types of support behind them. And the problem, I think, on Jake's side is he didn't think I would come and attack. I think he thought that's why he didn't bother
to be on the defensive the whole time.
Yeah. He thought he would be on the offensive because in all his debates that I've seen, Jake is the one attacking the other person and the other person is defending. And to be honest, that my nature as an academic is to just answer questions. I don't usually go around trying to invalidate other people's positions. It's just not what I do. So probably what Jake has heard from me in different spaces is me sort of just being playing, constructive defense. Which is what we are trained to do at conferences. When someone asks you a question at a conference, Bo, you answer the question. You don't counter argument.
That kind of brings us up. I mean, if that's kind of, I don't know if you're wrapped up on the review, that was what I was going to say as far as kind of assessing it. Should I go into that or?
Yeah, I'll just end off here. So, these 10 arguments are there. People could go back and assess them, for yourself. But I graded sort of the lack of engagement by Jake on these arguments because I don't think he answered them in any adequate way. But let's sort of trying to make sure let's make sure we don't. Yeah. So I think we can sort of move on to the next thing. So sort of your higher level pattern that you detected in.
Well, I was just gonna say before I thought when you're mentioning in a conference or something, you just answer the questions, and that was one thing that occurred to me while I was watching the debate was especially the cross-examination really was where I felt like it was just over for me there, because when he cross-examined you did just answer the questions, and in every case it was like it seemed to me like you had a text just at your command, and like you knew the broader context, and you could say, well, here's this distinction that you're not getting, and in each case, I mean, a lot of the first parts of it, like there are a lot of authors I'm not as familiar with, and debates I wasn't super familiar with, so some of it kind of went over my head, but in the cross-examination, it was like he'd give some kind of question and you just immediately had answer, and I felt like at the end of your answers, I had more clarity about the issue, and it, there was a broader perspective and I could kind of understand it. And then when you cross-examined him, it seemed like it was just kind of an exercise in like wasting time and trying to run out the clock and not really answer a question. And like, maybe, I don't know if that's a professional debate tactic or something like that, but for me as someone, like I want answer. I'm interested in these questions that you're debating. And I felt like from your end, I got more clarity, and from his end, I just kind of got like stonewalling.
Yeah. Look, I don't know about debate tactics. In preparation for the debate, I did read about William Lane Craig's debate style. I read about it extensively on how he does things, and I followed what you could call the William Lane Craig debate strategy, which means, and this is why I have 10 arguments. So the William Lane Craig debate strategy, and some atheists have written about this, so that's how I learned. Some atheists wrote a blog saying nobody should ever debate William Lane Craig. And they said it's because the guy seems to be trained in what is known as Lincoln Douglas debate style, where you have some positive arguments and you prepare your rebuttals in advance. So I prepared my rebuttals in advance, right? I studied everything Jake has ever said on video against my position. I prepared a rebuttal. I anticipated. So I had my rebuttal slides ready to go. And while Jake spoke, all I was doing on my computer was rearranging slides, putting it into the right slot. Oh, do I need this slide? Okay, let's add it in. So I prepared my rebuttals, and I structured my opening statement in this way because the idea is you offer at least 5 to 7. I offered 10 because it was easier to break it up for 10, but you offer several positive arguments for your position. And when the opponent fails to answer, you call them out on it. This is exactly how William Lane Craig debates. So if you watch his debate, he'll always say, look, I offered 5 arguments and my opponent only responded to 1, and they're so that's a debate style which I studied prior to the debate. And it's an effective style. It's not an undefeatable style. There's a way to, because if you read that article, it also talks about how Craig rebuts any arguments, right? How do you rebut? You group arguments together. So I did that, but I didn't study anything about cross-examination where you're supposed to wind down the clock. I thought cross-examination is actually a place where you could run away with the debate by answering everything. But just moving on to the wider point, what did you make? Because I said I would come back to this, but we can start with you, Bo. I'll just stop my screen. What did you make of sort of Jake's style of argument in your debate? Did you think he was debating the topic per se, or did you notice some other type of discourse?
Yeah, it seemed like he kind of wanted to two things, I guess. So one is he seemed like he kind of wanted to shift it from the actual debate topic to things about like the person, and whether your worldview overall is consistent, or something like that. Which is fine. Like, people have those kinds of debates, but I think you have to make the debate topic be my whole worldview versus your whole worldview or something. Another thing is that he seemed to either he has problems keeping track of the burden of proof, which sometimes undergraduates do, or I don't know if it's just a tactic or what. But like in my debate, he was supposed to take the affirmative position, to prove that the Eunomian premise is true, but he wanted to kind of turn it around to just sort of like, here are problems with your worldview overall, and in ways that, like, it wasn't obvious. Like the Lewis and Langton definitions thing was like, well, there's no obvious connection to how this positively proves your position. And it seemed like that happened in your debate too. Like, there wasn't really a positive argument for his position. The only thing that I did get out of it was kind of towards the end. If I sort of do some interpreting of what he said, it would be something like, just read the Quran and read these sunnah, these hadith, and would you ever get out of that anything about the divine intellect or anything like that, which is so brief. It's like you need to elaborate that argument quite a bit. And one thing that it presupposes is a kind of like, it as a Christian, it makes me think of like Protestants, like sola scriptura, like, that's just this presupposition that we just stick to the Bible. And in this case, we stick to the Quran and these hadith. And it's like, well, you have to back that up. And he didn't ever really back up why that's the right way to approach things. So yeah, it seemed like he didn't have much in the way of a positive argument, and he wanted to kind of turn it more towards just finding things to criticize about the person he's debating rather than the idea or the topic.
Yeah, I watched your debate, and I watched it live, and I noticed you had a good rejoinder to him. You said, "Hey, Jake, like, we're not here to debate my autobiography."
Yeah.
I think that says it all.
And my understanding of a formal debate is like, you're not supposed, you're really in the debate just supposed to respond to what the other person says during that debate, not like, well, here's something that you said in a tweet, or you have a video from your, and again, like, maybe I'm wrong because I'm not a trained formal debater either, but my understanding is like the cross-examination period, part of the point of that is, if the person hasn't said certain things that you thought they were going to, or you think there's this contradiction in their bigger worldview or whatever, you ask them the questions then, and that forces them to either admit that they do believe it and they've got this contradiction, or that they've rejected it, or whatever. So yeah, it seems like he could have used the cross-examination period for those sort of purposes. But
yeah, so in my debate, as you said, there was no real positive case for his position, and I think all of his arguments were against me were meant to be internal critiques. So
yeah,
his arguments 2, 3, and 4, which I answered, had they actually been based on fact, they could have been internal critiques, like Ismailis don't prove God, Ismailis can't talk about God. That could have been a good internal critique had it been factual. Unfortunately, it wasn't.
Right. Yeah.
His first argument against me, which I've sort of summarized, this was the first thing he said. And he calls this an internal critique, but I don't think this is an internal critique. I think this is an ad hominem attack. So he basically said that Khalil Andani cannot defend both Islamic philosophy and Ismaili Neoplatonism because they differ in 3 areas, and that they're basically irreconcilable. Now, this type of argument was odd because, firstly, by Islamic philosophy, what Jake meant is Ibn Sina's philosophy. He's just the person that the term is associated with. And what Jake was doing here is he was playing off the ambiguity of the debate title. Right? Sorry, give me 1 second.
You got to get some soundproofing.
Yeah, sorry. So what he was saying is, I think by Islamic philosophy, he meant Ibn Sina's philosophy. And he was trading on the ambiguity of the debate title. So the debate title said Islamic philosophy, but it was only named Islamic philosophy with full knowledge that I was defending an Ismaili version of it. That was fully disclosed. But Jake was trying to say that I was actually defending Ibn Sina's philosophy and Ismaili thought at the same time. That's his first claim, and that both of these are incompatible, which is sort of a subsidiary claim, and that therefore I cannot personally participate in the debate because I allegedly believe in 2 mutually contradictory worldviews. Now, the problem with this is that, look, let's just say this is true, okay? Let's say I'm a contradictory individual, and I believe in 2 worldviews at the same time. Let's just say it's correct. It's not correct, but let's just assume it's correct. Okay, but what relevance does that have to the debate position, right?
Yeah,
like
that's
one of
what
them
I
can
think
still be correct.
Yeah. No, it's like, I mean, so suppose your whole worldview is contradictory and crazy, but for me, like, I'm watching this debate kind of thinking, suppose I decided to become a Muslim, would I rather be Ismaili or Aseity or what? And like, no offense to you, but like, I don't really care that much about Khalil Andani and whether he ends up having a coherent worldview or whatever. Like, so maybe you're crazy and you believe different stuff, but like, how does that help me decide whether a broadly Neoplatonic version of Islam makes sense and would be the most rational way to go versus the Aseity creed? Like, it just doesn't really help me as a viewer.
Yeah, and I said this in the debate. I said the debates are about the positions, the 2 positions being debated. They're not about personal beliefs. And Jake intentionally misconstrued that to mean that I conceded that I'm not defending what I actually believe in. No. So everybody knows this because unlike Jake, I actually have published work out there. I am an Ismaili Muslim. It's reflected in the things I choose to write about in my YouTube channel. I am an Ismaili Muslim. I hold to a Ismaili Neoplatonic worldview, and I'm not a follower of Ibn Sina. You can ask actual followers of Ibn Sina if they consider me one of their own. They will say no, right? So I'm not a follower of Ibn Sina. But the first thing is that even if I was a follower of Ibn Sina and I was Ismaili, it wouldn't be a problem because being Ismaili doesn't mean you have to commit to a medieval thinker from 1,000 years ago. Like being Ismaili is a broader spiritual orientation. So in fact, a person could be a follower of Ibn Sina and be an Ismaili Muslim. We have this. So we have somebody named Nasir al-Tusi who was a follower of Ibn Sina, he was an Ismaili Muslim. He didn't see the systems as incompatible. So even that claim that these are fundamentally incompatible, it historically is not a claim that has borne out. And furthermore, perhaps Jake thought that because I have used Ibn Sina's argument for God or some version of it, that makes me a full-fledged follower of Ibn Sina. But this is again not the case. Numerous Muslims, Sunnis, Sufis, Twelvers, and Ismailis adopted some of Ibn Sina's ideas without adopting the whole thing. So that's why I felt this argument was really not an argument germane to the debate in any way. It was actually about attacking me personally. And even in that case, Jake mentioned three so-called irreconcilable differences between Avicenna and Ismaili thought. 3 points, which he pressed them in the debate, and I, answered all of them. But I noticed this was his common tactic: make it about the individual and alleged beliefs of the individual. Whereas what I wanted in the debate is I wanted someone to use Game of Thrones terminology. I wanted someone to meet me on the open field of metaphysics. I wanted someone to say, this is why divine simplicity is false. This is why creation cannot be eternal. I wanted someone, to meet me on like one-on-one intellectual dueling. I didn't want someone to try and just say, well, you can't debate me because that's completely, missing the point.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it seems like a lot of ad hominem, and it's a weird, it's a little bit like the thing with citation. Like, you can cite someone without agreeing with them 100%, and obviously an Ismaili could adopt parts of Ibn Sina's philosophy without agreeing with him 100%. Like, there's ways of mixing and matching ideas, and it seems obvious that that's possible. But it seemed like he wanted to say sort of you are for some reason 100% committed to everything Ibn Sina ever said, and then you're also 100% committed to, stuff from the Ismaili tradition that, and I can find some inconsistencies there. I think my feeling about Jake is like he's a very he's a good, clever undergraduate student, right? Like, that's what I would expect from most a good philosophy undergraduates. Like, he can find some conflicts and contradictions, but it's sort of like that's as far as he's gone. Like, he just can find some contradictions between, and so he wants people to commit to, a whole bunch of stuff, and he can find a contradiction, but people don't. Ideas don't always work that way. It's not always going to pan out that you're, just some specific point might not, even if it's part of a broader worldview and you can find some problems with it or whatever, you might not really have an argument against just the specific points that you're trying to defend.
Yes, absolutely. I think what people lose sight of, and I think this would be my criticism of analytic philosophers. It would also be my criticism of today's debaters. People don't realize that Christian and Muslim intellectual traditions are dynamic and fluid. They don't just freeze frame in 1 year, right? These traditions change, and for that reason, we do find a lot of cross-pollination, at least within Islam, of traditions that originate differently: Ibn Sina, Ismaili, Sufism, and then they all cross-pollinate in a later period. They sort of hybridize together into new intellectual traditions. And I imagine it's the same thing in the Christian tradition. I just read from Edward Fazer did a tweet today. Apparently, there's at least 3 schools of Thomism today now.
Yeah, right.
So this is something I think my training as an intellectual historian has really showed me this, that you can't confuse philosophical positions with intellectual history. A position from the perspective of a human can entertain many types of philosophical positions. They can change their positions over time, and this is a historical process. But let's sort of move on. So we're now going to go to one of those common themes, common threads, let's say, right, between the two debates, and we'll begin with we can begin with what something from your debate, and I think we'll begin by just playing the clip. So the clip we're going to show, I'll get it on the screen here. This is the cross-examination that you had with Jake. I'll just get it back up. So you were cross-examining him, and again, your debate was about, can you have a divine nature without aseity?
Yeah.
Right. So let me play the clip. I'll speed it up a little bit. Should have 1.5 and get it back on the screen here. And then we can. I'll pause. We can either play the whole thing. It'll go quick, or I can pause it at certain parts. I'm not sure what you.
Maybe I'll just hold my hand up if I want to.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So let's begin. All right. So this is Bo cross-examining Jake about the notion of aseity, divine attributes, this sort of thing.
Sometimes, so for example, St. Irenaeus and some other church fathers put it this way. They talk about the Son and the Holy Spirit as like the right and left hands of God. So meaning sort of they're like these causal intermediaries that God interacts with the world through. I know this kind of I guess different people have different views about this, but in the Quran it talks a little about God's hands or whatever. So some people don't take that very literally. Some people just take it to be, I guess, a metaphor for something like the way God causally interacts with things or attributes or something like that. How do you take that? Do you take it that God literally has physical hands, or do you take those to be kind of attributes, or do you have a different interpretation of it?
They're attributes.
They're attributes, okay. But they're distinct from God himself.
In what sense?
Meaning just God isn't a hand, or whatever.
They're not identical to them.
Okay.
But they're not separate. They're not separate.
So they're not identical. Okay, but they're not separable. So there's would you say there's been any time at which God was without these attributes?
No.
And so would you say that the attributes are created?
No. How would they be created?
It's not a trick question. I just want to make sure that I'm on the right page. So what about their existence in different possible worlds? Do you think there are possible worlds where God lacks those attributes?
No.
Okay. So those attributes, then it's safe to say, are necessarily existent. They're eternal and they're uncreated. Are they also ase?
Depends what you mean by that.
Are they in any sense caused or dependent on God, or are they just kind of independent things that aren't in any sense?
They're not independent of God.
Okay, so you wouldn't say they're like absolutely ase beings, like
no.
Lee Craig with this Cerberus Trinity. Okay, so then it seems like we've gotten the conclusion that necessary existence as such doesn't require.
Sorry, there's a request to slow it down a bit. Let me slow it down.
Okay, maybe while you're paused here too, I'll just kind of go over what we've. So what I've asked him is about God's. So first of all, one thing is when I asked him about the hands, are they physical hands, are they attributes, or what are they? It was just like attributes, like that's it. And then he said, okay, these attributes of God. I pointed out that in the Christian tradition, a lot of times church fathers refer to the Son and the Holy Spirit as God's right and left hands. So there's some relevance there. But he says, okay, these hands or attributes exist in all possible worlds, just like God does. They exist at all times along with God. So they were never brought into being out of non-being and so forth. So they're necessary, they're eternal, they're uncreated, at least in this, I guess, our sense of creation. They're not brought into being out of non-being, but yet he admits that they're ab alio, right? So and they're not identical to God, right? These are things that are they're inseparable from God, but they're distinct from God, and that's exactly what we say about the Son and the Holy Spirit. Is they're not God, but they're not separable from God. They're like His hands, right? And so he seems to just be admitting that that's all totally possible.
I'm just going to play a little bit of it again on a bit slower speed.
Okay. You had a different interpretation of it.
They're attributes.
They're attributes, okay. But they're distinct from God himself.
In what sense?
Meaning just God is at the hand, or whatever.
They're not identical to them.
Okay.
But they're not separate. They're not separable.
Yeah, so they're not identical, but not
Okay.
separable, right? That's the first point. Which, to be fair, this is what you would call a Sunni Kalam position on the attributes, right? They have this sort of denial of identity, but then denial of separability. So that's what he's saying there. And we'll continue.
So they're not identical, okay, but they're not separable. So there's, would you say there's been any time at which God was without these attributes?
No.
Okay, so they're eternal.
Right.
Right? Always exist.
And so would you say that the attributes are created?
No.
All right, so they're not created, which means they're uncreated. So indirectly, he's saying that they are divine.
Yeah, because in their view, I mean,
if something is not created, it's divine, right? Like he's basically conceding that these attributes, which are not identical to God, are divine, right? They're eternal, uncreated.
Oh, they be great.
It's not a trick question. I just want to make sure that I'm on the right page. So what about their existence in different possible worlds? Do you think there are possible worlds where God lacks those attributes?
No.
Okay.
So they exist in all possible worlds, which means they are modally necessary, right? How the analytics,
how we define necessarily true.
Yeah, how you guys define necessary, they're necessary. Not how I define.
Not how you define necessary.
Yeah. And as for what Jake thinks is necessary, it's just not clear to me what he thinks. Like he seems to jump around both.
And by the way, I guess I'll just interject here. The reason that's important for me is the argument that I have that Jake and I will, I guess, never debate because he doesn't want to do the second. We were going to have a second debate where I have this argument for the existence of a second divine person. So not a whole argument for the Trinity, but for a second divine person. And it turns on this issue of whether a divine being would be necessarily existent. And he seems to be willing to say that you could have a necessary, and I mean that in the sense of existing in all possible worlds. So he seems to be admitting you could have something that exists in all possible worlds, but it's Abba Alio.
Yeah.
So those attributes, then, it's safe to say, are necessarily existent. They're eternal and they're uncreated.
Just pause. So, if in your view, Bo, if something is necessarily existent, eternal, and uncreated, that would make it divine in your worldview, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, broadly speaking, it's divine. Yeah.
Okay. And for him too, like it's also divine.
That's what I was going to say. I think that's the Sunni sort of view too, right? If it's
okay.
It's part of it.
Are they also Aseity?
Depends what you mean by that.
Okay, wait, what? Depends what you mean, but what is the title of this debate that Jake titled? Is it impossible to have the divine nature without Aseity? And now he doesn't know what Aseity means.
Which we agreed ahead of time on what the definition of Ase and Ab Alio would be, and we agreed on what the definition of nature would be. So, yeah.
There's an interesting comment from African Dawa Revival. I know this channel. I'm pretty sure they agree with Jake on issues. And you've said something odd. Individual attributes are divine, but not fully divine. So I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. Sorry, I have being invaded by children over here.
Right.
They're not fully divine. I mean, if you mean that they're necessary through another, then that's exactly what's being conceded. All right, keep going.
Are they in any sense cause or dependent on God, or are they just kind of independent things that aren't in any sense?
They're not independent of God.
Okay, so then you wouldn't say they're like absolutely Aseity beings, like St. Craig with his Cerberus. Okay, so then it seems like we've gotten the conclusion that necessary existence as such doesn't require Aseity. Eternality as such doesn't require Aseity. createdness as such doesn't require aseity. None of those three things in combination apparently requires aseity. Also, it seems like the
we can pause there if you. Just so the point of that is just to say, again, the debate topic was, does the divine nature require absolute aseity? And I'm just pointing out that it looks like, on his view, being, existing in all possible worlds doesn't require aseity. Being eternal doesn't require aseity. Being uncreated doesn't require aseity. So sort of all these other, features of God, of the divine nature, don't require aseity. So the question that I had is just kind of, then why is it that the divine nature as a whole requires aseity if no, particular fact about it does?
All right, let's continue.
Sure.
I think that God would have like omniscience and omnibenevolence and omnipotence and so forth. Don't just sort of by definition require aseity.
I'm not really following what you're saying, to be honest.
Well, just those. So none of those attributes require.
But how does it map onto the discussion? Because this seems to really be deviating from the discussion.
Right. So the question is, can you have the divine nature without aseity? And it looks to me
Yeah, but
all of
that's not the same thing, though. When you talk about the hand of God, or you talk about the power, it's not a nature. It's not a divine nature.
I'm going to pause it there. How can he say that the hand of God or the power of God do not have a divine nature? They are divine attributes. They are uncreated, they're eternal, and they're necessary in all possible worlds. If he says they don't have a divine nature, then he's saying these are created attributes. So I find that to be inconsistent.
I guess to be charitable to Jake, what he's gonna say is like, they themselves don't instantiate the divine nature. But the issue wasn't that. My argument wasn't that the attributes have the divine nature. My point was just, for any given fact about the divine nature, like, it seems like we can, on his own admission, he'll grant that it's compatible with being ab alio. Right. So he seems to admit that, like, you could be like something could be omniscient without being ase. Something could be existing in every possible world without being ase. Something could be eternal without being ase. So he seems to kind of just admit that individually, everything I would want to say about the divine nature is consistent with being ab alio instead of ase. But then somehow, when you smush it all together, that's impossible now. And that was what my argument was.
So it's not analogous at all. Yeah, so it's not analogous to what we're talking about.
When I said here, yeah, it's not analogous.
Yeah, so on this point, I think this is sort of where we marked off to stop this portion. So he's saying, look, they're not the attributes that he believes in, and the Son of God, for example, or the Holy Spirit, are not analogous.
Right.
So now this is an interesting claim.
Which again, so there's 2 points to make here. One is that my argument was not an argument by analogy. So I wasn't arguing that the attributes are analogous to divine persons. I'm just saying they provide a counterexample to the eunomian premise, right? So you can have things that exist in all possible worlds, but they're not ase. They are eternal, but they're not ase, etc. But while we're on the topic, I think it is interesting to explore, like, how analogous they might be. So I have a few slides on that if you want to put them up. Because they actually are. I'm not committed to saying that they have to be analogous, but it's interesting that there are some interesting tie-ins. So, this, I guess, Sunni in general reject divine simplicity. At least certainly Jake does, right? So some issues here. So these attributes are real; they're existent. So, like you were saying earlier, they're concrete things. They're not just verbal predicates, right? And they're distinct from God in the sense that they're not just, God isn't just identical to these attributes, or they're not just all different names for the same thing. But yet they're ab alio because they depend on God, and they're necessarily existent because God, they're essential to God. God has these properties in every possible world. And it does seem like there are some deep similarities, even if there's some differences. There's similarities between these Sunni attributes and the Son and the Holy Spirit in Trinitarian thought. So one thing, just right off the top of my head, when I was thinking about this, I thought Thomas Aquinas, the way that he formulates the doctrine of the Trinity is he says, yeah, you've got this one absolutely simple divine nature or essence. And then he says the persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are what he calls subsistent relations, which sounds a lot like existent attributes, right? And just instead of attribute, they're relations of begetting and proceeding. So already right there, I mean, like that does seem like that's kind of sounds like Aquinas's formulation of things. Also, I think you were maybe going to mention later a lot of like Arabic Christians from early on in this like early encounter between Islam and Christianity. They will frequent, and I know some of that literature because I'm interested in that. So I know like they frequently try to explain the Trinity to Muslims by saying, well, God has these attributes of logos and spirit, right? And but they're inseparable from them, and they're concrete, like they're real, they're existent, they're not just kind of, so it does sound a lot like the Trinity. And I don't know if this is too much text, but here's a passage from John of Damascus that I think is very very telling. So he lived, I think if I did my calculation correctly, so he lived around 675 to 749 AD, which I think is about 55 to 131 on the Islamic calendar. So pretty early in the history of Islam. And just as background, he was a Christian living. So his father worked for the caliph, and then he did in the government. So and he would have spoken Arabic. He wrote in Greek because it was kind of the language Christians used, but he knew Arabic. There's some debate about whether he wrote this particular passage, but most people think that this part of his work on heresies is something that he wrote. And he was not very fond of Islam. It didn't give a lot of charitable, nuanced readings of anything. So it's interesting to me kind of what he leaves out and what he says, and just to compare this to what Jake says. So John of Damascus says, moreover, they, Muslims, call us Hitarias, or associators, because they say we introduce an associate with God by declaring Christ to be the Son of God and God. We say to them, as long as you say that Christ is the Word of God and Spirit, why do you accuse us of being Hitarias, associators? And this is what he says. Notice how similar this sounds to Jake. He says, for the Word and the Spirit is inseparable from that in which it naturally has existence. That sounds like what Jake is saying with God's attributes are inseparable from God, because that's what they naturally have existence in, their attributes, right? And he says, therefore, if the Word of God is in God, then it's obvious that he is God. And I'll just say, too, by the way, I mean, Christians typically have had a kind of broader use of the word God, where it doesn't necessarily just refer to this individual, but it kind of has this broader meaning of divine in a more general sense. So if the Word of God is in God, then he is God. Well, that sounds a lot like he's saying, okay, if God's attribute of knowledge or kalam or logos, whatever, is in God, then it's divine, right? It's part of God. And here's an argument that, so here's John of Damascus's argument. He says, if, however, he's outside of God, then according to you, God is without word and without spirit. And an interesting thing I noticed is that that's kind of an argument that Jake gave against your position was that if you put these attributes outside of God and you put them in this first intellect, well, then you're saying that God, he's not really all knowing, and he's not really, he doesn't really have these attributes. So it's interesting to me because I'm looking at this thinking like, well, this looks like what was originally a Christian argument against Islam, and now it's a Sunni argument against Shia position, right? And that seemed awkward, right, to me. And then the last thing here that I wanted to point out is sort of something that he doesn't say. So he says, consequently, by avoiding the introduction of an associate with God, you've mutilated him. It would be better for you to say that he has an associate than to mutilate him, as if you were dealing with a stone or a piece of wood or some other inanimate object. So again, it's like, for you, God is an inanimate object because life, the attribute of life, is down in the intellect, and his knowledge is down in the intellect. It's not really directly attached to God. And the thing that occurred to me is, if John of even if this is a bad argument, right? If John of Damascus could have made this argument, I think he would have said, if there were Muslims around at the time who thought that there were these divine attributes that are inseparably attached to God, but they're not identical to God, I think he would definitely have said, "Hey, you guys are hypocrites, man." Even if that's a bad argument, I think he would have been happy to use that argument. And so the fact that he doesn't, like John of Damascus never mentions that there are Muslims who will admit that God has a word and a spirit and so forth, but it just seems like it must be that at that early period, there were not Muslims that were making this point. And so it does, I think, lend some credibility to the idea that this must have come from engagement with Christian apologists like John of Damascus, and sort of pushing the Sunni majority into this view. Because otherwise, I don't know, why would John of Damascus not have made use of that polemically? Like I like John of Damascus, but I think he would have used used whatever ammo he had, because you can probably tell just from this little snippet and other stuff that he wrote, like he didn't like Islam. Like he would have used whatever argument he could have had. So it just seems to me like this must be something that's coming from kind of from outside.
Yeah. I'll just add this, since we're on this point of history. I was just going to share something on my end. So regarding the whole Sunni attribute theology, where did it come from? This was part of my opening in the debate. So there's two sort of factoids here to know. The first is that if you really took an Aseity, i.e. text-centered approach to the question of the divine nature, you could not get the doctrine of real distinct attributes from the Quran or the Hadith. They don't talk about attributes. There's no mention of God possessing sifat, attributes, or entitative attributes that are distinct.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I forgot that you said that, and I was going to ask about that. Like if that's the view, if it's like only the Quran and the Hadith, that's our whole basis, then like, does the Quran ever talk about attributes? Do the Hadith?
No. Yeah. So the understanding of attributes that are held in the Sunni theological tradition, and even in Jake's Aseity creed and the Salafi creed, where the attributes are distinct from God's essence, but inseparable, that is not articulated in the Quran and the Hadith. What the Quran and the Hadith have is they have names of God, right? Like the knower, the powerful, and they have
verbal
verbal
predicates.
predications, which we call wasf in Arabic, i.e., a verbal description. Or they have relations, like they talk about the hand of God or the power of God, which is a relational predication. But they never go out and say God possesses something called power, which is a entitative attribute, distinct from him but inseparable. That it actually comes from speculative theology. So it has been hypothesized by modern scholarship, such as Henry Austin Wolfson, that this Sunni Athari doctrine that God has real distinct entitative attributes that are distinct but inseparable from his essence, that this was actually developed from Christian Arab Trinitarian theology. And Wolfson himself even says that it seems that there is a relation between the Muslim belief in attributes and the Christian belief in the Trinity. The Son and the Holy Spirit in Arab Christian discourse were described as life and knowledge, or God's knowledge and life, or God's knowledge and power. And it is these two persons of the Trinity, the Son and the Holy Spirit, that were transformed into Muslim attributes.
Right.
In fact, the same names in Arabic, the Christian texts refer to the Son and the Holy Spirit as khawas, properties, or sifat, attributes, and the Muslims, the Sunnis, refer to their attributes as sifat. Now, I didn't show this in the debate, but I can go further on this, like if people want some more receipts. So here we have a great book by Sarah Leila Hosseini called Early Christian Muslim Debates. And that book...
Oh, there it is. Okay.
That book looks at three Christian theologians from the 800s, namely Abu Theodore Abu Qura, Abu Raitha, and Amar al-Basri. And for all three of them, she says there is a likening of the doctrine of the Trinity to the divine attributes as conceived in Islamic thought. And we know that the founder of the attribute doctrine, for the Sunni proto-Sunni tradition, is a person named Ibn Kulab, who is quoted on the screen. The names and attributes of God are not God and not other than him, right? This is where your not identical, not separable doctrine comes from. It comes from Ibn Kulab. Now, we have a report in an Islamic source where a Christian tells us that the Christian, and Ibn Kulab would often sit together, and Ibn Kulab learned this doctrine of the attributes are not identical and not separable. Ibn Kulab learned the doctrine from Christians. So that's an interesting report. Now, maybe it's false, I don't know. But then what cannot be denied is that the Christian authors of the 800s, 900s, and thousands, they directly equate the persons of the Trinity, or the basis of the persons of the Trinity, with the divine attributes of life and knowledge, or life and reason. And I've given examples even after these three, Abu Qura, Amar al-Basri, Abu Raitha, they lived in the 800s. But then after the 800s, you have people in later periods, Ilyas of Nisibis and Ibn at-Tayyib. And both of these directly say that the persons of the Trinity are either the attributes themselves, or the persons of the Trinity refer to the divine essence taken with a particular attribute. And sifat is there, as you can see from the terminology. So it is, there is a clear analogy, if not identity, between the.
It looks like there's even a historical line you can draw from, potentially this guy talked to this guy and they exchanged ideas. Yeah.
Now, I would say that the big difference is this. The biggest difference is this. While the Sunni attributionists and the Christians, they do refer to eternal, uncreated, divine attributes that are distinct from the divine substance or essence. They say that. That they're inseparable from God's essence. They all say that. Whereas the Muslims who believe in this doctrine, they stop at that point. But the Christians go one step, and they say the attribute is somehow identical to God, or they call that particular attribute God, i.e. the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. Whereas the Muslims, to my knowledge, they stop. They don't actually say God's power is God or anything like that.
Yeah. The interesting thing, though, is at one point in the debate, Jake said that he took the word God to refer to the essence along with the attributes, right? And it seems like, well, I mean, if you do that, then it looks like, well, maybe the attributes are an aspect of God or part of God in some sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is
So
what he
again,
did in the cross-examination with me. I mean, he seems to have changed his position between the two debates or during these debates, whereas sometimes he talks about God plus these attributes, which are inseparable from God, which is what he told you.
Right.
But when I crossed him and he first, I mean, we can actually, I don't know if we want to show that before we go to your that formula you wanted to show. Should we go to my cross of him?
You can if you want. I don't have any
Yeah.
clips loaded up, but
Yes, I can. Let's do that. So we'll go to my cross of Jake. So this is where, like, it's almost like the similar conversation I'm having with Jake on the same topic that you were having with him. And let me put it up here. This was actually very frustrating for a lot of people, I'm told.
The cross-examination.
Yeah, like even for viewers, because like he wasn't answering questions. So I'll speed it up a little bit, and we'll give a little bit of commentary. All right, so let's go.
With attributes and constitutions, you hold that God's attributes are distinct, not identical to God's essence. So, do the attributes depend on God's essence, or are they ase necessary in themselves?
What do you mean by depend?
All right, so right there, he doesn't know what depend means.
Yeah,
I mean, he seemed to know it like just a few minutes earlier when he asked me, "Does God depend on creation or whatever?" He debated you on the topic of dependence, and now he doesn't know what it means. So,
yeah.
Does the existence of an attribute of Allah depend on the essence?
In the same way that for you, the existence of creation or God's existence depends on the existence of creation.
This, of course, was evading. I never said that, and that's what's going to come out in this.
Either the attributes depend on God's essence or they don't. Which is it?
Yes, in the same way that you would say that God's existence depends upon creation.
I don't say that, though. So I want a clear answer. So I'm saying
Yeah, you just said that before.
See, this is like the basketball game where there's like 2 minutes left, and the team is like one team is trying to score like a bunch of points to win, and then the defense is just running the clock, right? They're not interested in playing. They're
Yeah.
Well, there's a tape here, so we'll watch.
Exactly.
So I'm going to take it that you said the attributes depend on the essence to exist. Okay.
I didn't say that.
So again, he did say that. He just said they do depend on the essence. Like you think God depends on creation. He uses the term depend. So a contradiction.
You just said that.
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'm going to ask you again. Are the attributes of Allah, are they ase or not ase?
That's a different question.
Who cares if it's a different question? What, like?
Are you conflating?
Okay, I'm changing the question. Answer my question.
Why are you changing the question?
Because.
So he chided me for asking him a question when he crossed me, and he's asked me like 3-4 questions already.
I was gonna say, that was I think someone counted it up, and there was like 23 times or something that he asked you a question during your cross-examination of him, which he's not supposed to even do.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's another thing where I feel like he's got this approach of just like, he wants the other guy to be on the defensive. And like, when you're asking questions, that kind of puts you on the defensive, but it's like, just answer the question,
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
That's my right. Answer my question.
Okay, so what's your new question?
I already.
Again, right? Time wasting.
Yeah.
Moderator, he's just evading here. He's not answering my question.
What's your question?
Are each distinct divine attribute, is it dependent on God's essence or is it ase?
Depends what you mean by dependent.
Okay, now I want to stress this here. So 2 times Jake has pleaded ignorance. He just doesn't know what depends means. He doesn't know what aseity means. So I want to play something very quickly. This is from I think 2 weeks earlier, okay, 2 or 3 weeks before Jake debated me, Jake debated Dr. Bo Branson, who's right here with us. So you saw this, and this is what Jake said in the opening statement with Bo Branson, because he just asked me, what does depend means, right? What does Aseity mean? Well, maybe does Jake know what these things mean? Well, here's what he says.
Said modalities and how I'm applying it to the title of this debate. The next term that must be defined is aseity. Aseity derives from the Latin meaning from oneself as opposed to ab alio, which is through another. So something is ase if and only if its existence is uncaused and not dependent on another. The final word that needs to be clarified.
Okay, so he just defined aseity 2 weeks, 3 weeks before speaking to me, and he defined aseity as the negation of dependence. That's what Jake did.
Yeah,
Now,
which may sound like dependence then must be just a straightforward thing that everyone understands, but
yeah,
now he doesn't
so
understand.
with me, he doesn't know. He just said it depends what depends means, and it is a bit odd. He's asking me to define a term that he just used in the question, right? It depends what depends means, but you know what depends means because you just used it. So, anyway,
True. Yeah.
The divine essence is the necessary and sufficient condition for that attribute, and you're not allowed to ask me a question. I want to answer now, or I'm going to take it that you forfeit the question because you cannot defend your creed.
I answered you. I said it
You have
depends.
not answered it. You have not answered my question. I'm going to give you one last chance. I'm going to give you one more chance.
Listen, I'm able to respond. Am I not?
You're not responding. You keep
Yes,
saying
I am
I've answered
responding.
already.
It depends what you mean by depend.
again, I think like fourth time, it depends what you means by depends.
Yeah.
I mean, you just use the word. If you can use the word in a sentence, I think you know what it means.
Probably understand it. Yeah.
Is it that?
I mean, the thing that annoys me, but analytic philosophers do this a lot too, like, quibbling about the definition of a particular term. In a lot of cases, though, like, you could just go on with the art, like, you could just give a definition, whatever your definition of depend is, give that, or you could just go on, and if it becomes a problem later, then you could say, okay, well, it looks like we're using the word depend in two different ways, and let's disambiguate it. But here it just struck me as like he's not going to give his own definition and then give his own answer, and he's not going to just like give an answer and say, well, we can come back and disambiguate it later, or just say, well, here's 2 or 3 different things you might mean, and I'd say it's true in this sense but not in these senses, or something. Like there's a lot of ways in which you could answer the question and then just go on, and it seems like he just was just trying to waste time.
I mean, if you remember when he asked me, he said, do you say the first intellect is a necessary being? I said, yeah, it's a necessary being in this sense,
right?
And
yeah,
it's not
you
a
just gave
necessary
it
being in the other sense.
disambiguation. Yeah.
All right, let's continue.
Definition of dependence that I don't share, and that you can't proceed with your argument unless I agree with your definition. Is that your problem?
You have already used the term depend throughout the so you define dependence, and you tell me, do the attributes depend on the essence or not?
I just told you, in the sense that you just said that creation depends on God, and God depends on creation.
Creation depends on. Okay, hold on. So just let's make some break here. So creation depends on God. I said that, yes. Are you saying that the attributes depend on the essence the same way creation depends on God?
I'm saying there's a counterfactual dependence.
Yeah, that doesn't matter though. So this is irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant.
Are they say or not? You're not answering the question.
You asked me about dependence, and I'm answering you. I'm saying there's a counterfactual dependence.
Okay, let me define it for you. Let me just.
Okay, so here, this is again not answering the not clearly answering the question. I took that as a yes. They are dependent. It doesn't matter whether it's counterfactual or whatever. That all I wanted him to say is that the attributes are dependent, because then they're not ase.
Yeah, one thing I thought here is like it seems like, at least here in certain places, he wants to kind of reduce the idea of dependence to what he's calling counterfactual dependence, which he didn't really define, but presumably that just means like X depends on Y means there's no possible world where X exists without Y.
Right.
But if that's what he means by it, then like
It doesn't answer the question. That's
Well,
why I
I mean,
didn't
so
accept
if
it.
that's what he means by, then he gets to say that for you, God depends on his creation, but the expense is that then he has to say that God depends on his attributes.
Right. And the attributes depend on God simultaneously.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true too. And so that wrecks his view. Like if he so he can take that approach and he gets an argument against you, but he doesn't seem to realize that that's wrecking his own view.
Yeah.
To do
Yeah,
it.
I agree. He doesn't
And
realize
the other option is, so here's another thing. I was going to get into this later, but basically no metaphysicians today, like in analytic philosophy, are happy with like a possible worlds or counterfactual account of like dependence. And that's why there's this whole literature now about grounding and fundamentality. And the reason is precisely, I mean, this is an argument that Fine gives. He just says, look, in any possible world where Socrates exists, the set that includes just Socrates exists, the unit set of Socrates exists. So they exist in the same possible worlds, but it's obvious that in some sense Socrates is more fundamental than the unit set of Socrates. And more to the point here, if God exists, then the unit set that includes just God exists, right? So are you going to say that God depends on his unit set? No one thinks that.
No, it's a unit set of X depends on X.
Yeah, there's an obvious sense in which the set depends on the thing and not vice versa, even though they exist in exactly the same possible worlds.
And that's why the counterfactual is a modal account of logical entailment, which it's not fine-grained enough to tell you about ontological dependence. And that's why I wasn't entertaining that answer. That's because he's not answering my question. I asked depends. I didn't say logic about possible worlds. That's why I was not accepting. I was like, it doesn't matter whether you call it counterfactual or not. Is there a dependence relation or not? I'll just continue.
It's funny. I just want to say too, I mean, it's funny that you just use the word, it's not fine grained enough. And that's literally what all of this grounding literature is about. And like Kit Fine's whole truth maker semantics and all this is exactly what he says is possible world semantics is not fine grained enough to make these distinctions. And that's why we have to give this more complex semantic. And it's just funny to me that you, as someone who's just trained in like religious studies and intellectual history and whatever, like you're able to see that, but like the metaphysician who's, trained in analytic philosophy or whatever seems to just want to make this like flat-footed sort of reduction of dependence to possible worlds and counterfactuals, which doesn't work. And I think you're exactly right. It's just not fine-grained enough for that.
Yep.
But anyway.
By itself. It can only exist if God first exists. Okay?
Is that a counterfactual dependence?
It doesn't matter what counterfactual dependence doesn't cover this.
Question should be one way.
I'm talking about grounding relations. Okay, God is the ground for the existence of the first intellect. Would you agree that God's essence is the ground for the attributes? Grounding relations are one way.
Right.
So now you're asking about grounding relations. Is that what you meant by dependence?
Yes. Are the attributes grounded by God's essence?
In the sense that they cannot exist without the other, but we don't say it's a causal dependency.
See, he's still not answering the question. He's giving me a modal answer, right? We don't want. It's not about whether they exist with the other or not. It's what is the ontological relationship between the attributes and the essence. We know that they're always.
You're being very precise here. I mean, it's like, is it grounded? Are the attributes grounded in the essence? That's the question. That's the fine-grained question. And he's like, well, in the sense that,
they cannot exist without the other.
Like he's going back to the counterfactual thing.
It doesn't answer the question. He's answering a modal question where I'm asking a grounding or ontological question.
Yeah.
I don't care what you say. I don't care what you say. So you
don't care what I say, but why are you asking the question?
Next question. Okay, so you said yes, they depend. You say it's not.
No, I said it's not causal dependency. There's no causal dependency.
It doesn't matter.
See, I didn't say causal dependency because for him, causal dependency is temporal in Jake's thing. But a non-temporal dependency, he won't call it a causal dependence. But for my purposes, that's all I need to show. Any type of dependency of the attributes on the essence negates the aseity, which I'm going to get to now.
Right, including grounding.
Counterfactual dependency.
It doesn't matter. The point is, the attributes depend on the essence. They do not exist on their
Only in the sense that they can't exist without each other.
Okay, so the attributes are not ase.
What?
I mean, he doesn't know what ase means.
The attributes are not ase.
Is that a question or a statement?
Yeah, well, agree or disagree?
In what sense? What do you mean by
Are the attributes?
What do you mean by ase? Well, Jake, you just defined it with Bo Branson like 3 weeks ago. You defined aseity to have a whole debate on it. Now you say, what do you mean by
then? Yeah.
I mean, this was comical, actually, when I go back and reflect. Like, this is like a comedy show.
The attributes are dependent on the essence, so they do not have aseity.
In the sense that they can't exist without the other.
Okay, good. Now, if something is not ase, can it be God?
All right, so if something is not ase, can it be God? That's my original question.
Right.
Sorry? What can be that?
Apparently he's deaf, he can't hear, and wants the question repeated.
Something is not ase. Is it contingent?
Okay, so now I changed the question a bit. I said, if something is not ase, right, is it contingent?
Anything that's not God, is it contingent? Is it?
Now he then rephrased the question. He changed the question. He did it. He said, if something is not God, is it contingent? But my question was, if something is not ase, is it contingent? But he took the question to mean it is not God.
Right. Yes. Yeah, sure. Okay, so therefore the attributes are contingent.
I mean, he changed the question. I didn't change the question, but now
he just affirmed that if something is not God, then it's not ase, and the attributes are not God.
Yeah.
So they're not ase.
Because they're not ase. So my question to you,
you didn't say ase, you said not God, and then you switched it with ase.
No, you see, Jake switched it. I didn't switch it.
Yeah.
I gave the question, if something is not ase, and he changed it to if it's not God. So he took ase to mean God. Like, he did the substitution, not me, and he said that I did the bait and switch.
And it's not like he affirmed that if something's not God, then it's not ase. And he says the attributes are not identical to God. They're not God.
Yeah.
So
again, you already said it.
No, you switched it. You just did a bait and switch.
I said, are the
attributes? You asked me if anything other than God is contingent, and I said yes. And then you tried to impute that and say that means that's referring to the attributes.
No, but Jake, you substituted if something is not ase, is it contingent? Jake, you substituted it for if something is not God. I didn't substitute it. He did it.
I said, if something is not ase, is it contingent? You said yes.
That was my original question.
Already said the attributes are not ase, so the attributes are contingent. So your God has contingent attributes.
No.
Okay, see, so we got it. I got him there. The attributes are contingent because they're not ase, which is Jake's belief. Now look what he does.
Not at all. The term God itself includes the essence and the attributes.
Oh, now look what happened. Now the word God has been redefined.
Yeah, this is where he gets into that's what I was mentioning earlier with, like, he's going to include the attributes within the definition of God.
Yeah.
So then there is some sense in which you should be able to say that they're God, like they're part of.
Apparently now the word God is talking about both. It refers to the essence and the attributes. But then his prior
sounds a lot like certain versions of Trinitarianism, right? Like
it does.
God is this
it sounds like William Lane Craig's God made up of three faculties or whatever it is, three-headed dog God, and all this. Anyway, the rest of the exchange on attributes sort of ends. And my ending thing to Jake is that, okay, if God is the essence and the attributes, well, you just admitted what I said in my opening slide. Your God is a conglomeration of multiple entities, which are codependent on one another. And actually, this actually goes to my chart that I had in the debate. So I wanted Jake to answer this question here, right? So you have God's essence and you have the attributes. Now, which ones are necessary, i.e. ase, and which ones are contingent or dependent. I wanted him, because I have this like four-horned dilemma for the complex theist. They need to answer. So either the attributes are ase and the essence depends on the attributes, right? Or the essence is ase and the attributes are dependent, which is what I thought he would go for, right? Or everything is ase, or none of them are ase. And he seems to have gone for number 4.
Yeah, I mean, if he wants that counterfactual account of what dependence is, then it looks like, well, you just automatically get the result that there's no possible world where God exists, but the attributes don't. And there's no possible world where the attributes exist, but God doesn't. So they're just both dependent on each other. Like if that's what dependence means.
Yeah, if that's so that's worse. That's actually the worst of these, because it means that this amalgam of essence and attributes, they are all codependent in a circular way. So then they need to depend on an external cause. And if you say no, they don't need to depend, they can just depend on each other like a circle. Well, then our friendly neighborhood atheist or pantheist can come along and say the universe depends on its parts, its constituents, and the constituents.
Each part of the universe depends on another part, but the
parts depend on the universe. That's it. That's what Jonathan Schaffer says, something along these lines. Priority, I think it's called priority monism or something. This view, number 4, I would even argue that even number 1 may fall into it. But the complex theist metaphysically is on par with the priority monist when it comes to this complexity, when they cash it out their theology in this way. That's what I would say. So it's very problematic. Now, somebody asked a question in the chat, what is my view of attributes? So this is our view of attributes in the Neoplatonic tradition, okay? So what we see is that in the cosmos, we see attributes that exist finitely, contingently, and distinctively in the cosmos. And then those attributes in the cosmos are traces of real distinct attributes that exist in the spiritual world, which we would call the universal soul. And the universal soul's attributes, which are distinct and finite, they are reflections of attributes that are formally distinct within the universal intellect. Okay, where obviously at this level you have these attributes are finite, but they're maximally great while still being finite at the level of the universal intellect. So this is all still within creation. So entitative attributes that are distinct and finite, the Neoplatonic tradition, puts those kinds of attributes within creation. All right. When it comes to God is pure oneness. So there are no entitative attributes within God. When you talk about God in the tradition I come from, when we make a verbal predication about God, so for example, if you say God is powerful, we would say that God transcends having power, i.e., bearing power, but rather God is the provider of all the powers within creation. This is what my tradition, the Ismaili tradition, says about predication. So if you make a predicative statement, God is X, and X is a predication, a positive predication, we interpret that to mean God is the originator or the provider of X to creatures. And this is known as metonymic speech. So this is a valid way of interpreting predication in the Arabic language or the English language. So that's my position, because I believe in divine simplicity.
And I was going to say, I mean, that I've always, so my understanding might be colored because we just kind of, in philosophy, when you're reading about medieval philosophy and stuff, you read about Islamic philosophy, and maybe it's colored because we just read certain people or whatever. But like, I've always just thought that was kind of like that was a pretty common move to make by Islamic philosophers. And I also kind of thought, like, I mean, that seems like Tawhid. Like, if you want God to be really one, like that's, and it, and I mean, so like that view doesn't work with the doctrine of the Trinity very well, I don't think, or anyway. There are people who try to have absolute divine simplicity in the doctrine of the Trinity, but it's But if you're Muslim, it just seems like why I keep puzzling over this now. It's like, why would you, if you're Muslim, why would you not like that view? Like, I just don't really like. I just don't get. And also another thing that's weird is I think like if I was debating you, for example, and I was going to try to get you out of this position, like the kinds of arguments that I would give, I think are basically the arguments that Jake would give. Like, I mean, basically, I think what he didn't like about this picture is like he wants God directly to have knowledge and power and all this stuff. He just thinks it's not, it's not enough if God just kind of creates this intellect that has all of these things. Like he want it directly attached to God. Like that's kind of what I would argue and then I try to get from there to the Trinity. But so it just like it seems strange to me as I'm looking and thinking like, it just seems awkward for a like Muslim against Muslim debate, and one side just seems like it's like this is, I would think, a Christian argument against, like, this is why you can't have absolute simplicity, and this is why Tawhid doesn't work that way.
It's interesting you mentioned this because historically in the 800s and the 900s, the most effective Muslims against the Trinitarians were the Mu'tazila, who, although are not Neoplatonists, affirm DDS. It's the DDS Muslims who could debate the Christians, the Trinitarians. I mean, some people have even told me, not that we would do it, but some people have told me, I don't know what you think, that the best orientation to debate your type of Trinitarianism would be Islamic Neoplatonism with strong DDS and so on, and certainly not like a Sunni attributionist theology.
Yeah, actually, maybe this is a good point. So I had a few slides about whether Jake maybe needs to buy into divine simplicity.
Sure, yeah, let's do that. So there we go.
So what I, in my debate review, what I noted was like if Jake had wanted to try to get this eunomian premise and like derive it from propositions I really do believe, what he could have done, and the only way that I can see that he could have done it would be, so I have this version of the modal ontological argument. So this is like premise, I just label it MOA1. It's not possible to have the divine nature but exist only contingently, or be divine only contingently. So that's like one premise in the an ontological argument for God's existence, and that I use for this argument about the second divine person. Well, if he had paired that with this, I just call the contingency of ab alio beings, you could get that. So that would say necessarily all ab alio beings are contingent, meaning they have to fail to exist in some possible worlds. So if you put those together, you'd get the eunomian premise. You'd get that it's not possible to have the divine nature but exist only contingently. And if you're ab alio, then you are contingent. So you'd get, if you're ab alio, then you're not divine. Or if you, conversely, if you are divine, then you're not ab alio. But the problem is that if you take that premise that he would have to use, that ab alio beings are contingent, put that all together. So if you say all ab alio beings are contingent, God is not identical to his attributes, right? Because he wants to reject divine simplicity. And he wants to say only God is absolutely ase, anything else is ab alio. So that means his attributes are ab alio. But then God's attributes exist in every possible world, so they're not contingent, right? So from 2 and 3, you get that God's attributes are ab alio. And then from 4, you get that they're contingent. But then 1 says that if they're ab alio, 4 says they're not contingent. They exist in all worlds. But 1 says if they're ab alio, then they have to be contingent. So you just get a contradiction there. So he has to give up one of these claims, right? Because that's a logically contradictory set of claims. And I just pointed out, like, you know, so the opposites would be either he has to say it is possible for something to be not absolutely ase, like we say the Son of God is, but it's possible for him to exist in every possible world. So if he does that, then he's kind of losing this argument against me. Or he has to buy into absolute divine simplicity, right? In which case he's kind of conceding the argument to you. Your only other options are to say, okay, God's not the only thing that's absolutely ase, which it sounds like polytheism. I mean, certainly I think from a Muslim perspective, that's polytheism. I even think that's polytheism, and I'm a Trinitarian. Like to me, and even for me, I mean, it's like for me, it's only God the Father is absolutely say, like, so that's even polytheism to the Trinitarian who's supposed to be a tritheist, right? And your other option is that God's attributes are just contingent, right? I mean, that would include even his essential attributes. So either God himself has to be a contingent being, or he just has no essential attributes or something. And so I mean, neither of those really works. So it seems like either he would have to not have this idea of the contingency of ab alio beings, in which case he's going to lose the argument to me, or he has to buy into divine simplicity, which is kind of the central idea of your whole theology. So it seems like he has to kind of pick one or the other argument to lose, basically.
Yeah, I would agree with you. He can't have both his cakes, basically.
Yeah.
But in either case, what I noted, the debate with me brought this out. With all respect to Jake, but I don't think Jake is operating with a coherent theology to begin with. Because with me, he switched his position. Like, we had about 6 months of prep. And after about 4 months or something, he changed his whole debate position that he was taking against me. Before our debate was arranged, he had an older video which he deleted, where he was not even an authoree at that point. This was like 6 months before our debate was arranged. So I think, in my advice for Jake and for anyone who engages in philosophical dialogue, and I think that to offer a foundational critique of another worldview, you need to have your worldview.
Yeah.
You need to have your own worldview. Otherwise, it's very much like some of those atheists who say we don't believe in metaphysics, and then they start making arguments against theism, right?
Based on metaphysics,
but they don't have a metaphysics. So I find that Jake, and not just him, but many of these Dawa personalities on the internet, they have not cashed out their worldview. They're not constructive thinkers. They only like to deconstruct other people's systems, and then they try to sort of make an entire career out of, guess who I debated so-and-so. But construction is more important, and this speaks to some of the comments in the chat. And Bo, I think your tradition would agree that constructive theology in a Christian context and in some Muslim traditions, including mine, is actually a form of worship. Like, we call this intellectual worship. But that's not polemics. Constructive theology is not polemics. Many people confuse these things. Constructive theology is a contemplative, reflective, and pious intellectual process and spiritual engagement that many people do. Some of us who do it are academics, like Bo and myself. You don't have to be an academic to do this type of constructive theology. But when we do constructive theology, we're not doing it because we want to prove everybody wrong. We're doing it to better understand our own faith commitments using this God-given intellect. And that is very different from going around debate challenging anybody with 2 arms and 2 legs, or perhaps not even that much. So that would be sort of the lesson, and that's why I don't really plan to continue doing debates after this one. It's just not productive. I think these theolocutions and interfaith dialogues with other academics or other theologians is far more productive use of time.
Yeah, I agree. And after this, I kind of I've promised one other person a debate, but I decided I'm not going to debate anyone that doesn't have a PhD, because I feel like there is a difference between the way academics approach these things and the way some apologists or whatever kind of approach it. And I do agree too that yeah, that's what I kind of meant by like a clever undergraduate. A lot of times you get these guys who like they're good at trying, they can kind of spot some contradictions and make criticisms, but it's like it takes a long time before you can start constructing some positive worldview. And yeah, actually, I thought that the debate that you had with Jake was very eye-opening to me about that issue, because it did strike me that like I yeah, it seems like either he just hasn't really had the time to think through his whole worldview, or I don't know, but it just doesn't seem very well thought out. And in certain ways, I guess when we talk about Mysterianism and stuff, in certain ways it seems like maybe it's not even really an attempt to come to a like an actual understanding or knowledge of God. It seems more like maybe just for whatever reason I've got this emotional attachment to this particular religious tradition now, and I'm just going to try to kind of make arguments and try to sort of make it work, which is not super interesting to me from an academic point of view.
Yeah. Okay, before we move on, one other matter I had to just quickly clarify just in a couple minutes. So I'm just gonna before we move to our other big topic. So I want to just make clarification again, because certain accusations have been made. So now I have to answer this. So it was claimed by Jake last week or whenever it was that I lied during the debate with him, and then that I admitted to lying about it. Of course, this is not true. So the issue was about God's will, okay, and the view of divine will that I hold to. So I believe that God's will is eternal and modally is necessary. That what God wills to happen, namely God creating the first intellect, could not have been any other way. This is my position. This is also the position of Ibn Sina, and Jake says that my position that God's will is modally necessary, not ontologically necessary, but modally necessary. Jake thinks that this is not the Ismaili position, and therefore he thinks I was lying about that, this being the Ismaili position in the debate. So I'll begin by just saying, look, we should not assume that will is understood in Islamic thought as libertarian will. The Sunni Kalam tradition thinks God's will is libertarian, but the philosophical and mystical traditions do not define God's will as libertarian will. The general concept of divine will in Islamic philosophy and mysticism is expressed by this phrase: if God wills the act, he will do it, or to do what one wills and to refrain from what one does not will. This is what you could call a compatibilist notion of divine will, right? It's divine will is not just the ability to do otherwise. So then the question is, the Ismailis of the classical period, they do believe God does everything by will. God's creation of the first intellect is an act of will. We do believe that. But do Ismailis believe in libertarian will, or do they believe in this sort of singular divine will that cannot be any other way, which is modally necessary divine will? So my position is that Ismailis reject libertarian will, and they believe in a divine will that cannot be any other way. That's my position. Now, here's what the Ismaili texts actually say. So we have here an Ismaili text from the 1200s, Nasir the Tusi writing as an Ismaili, where he actually goes out and says, when God became conscious of himself as the creator, which is an eternal self-knowledge of God, when God recognizes himself as the creator, from that realization, creation became necessary, and the creation is the first intellect. So this is outright necessitarian divine will, right? So creation is necessary. It's necessitated by God, according to Nasir the Tusi, who is an Ismaili philosopher. At least even if you think he left the Ismaili fold, when he wrote this, he's an Ismaili. But if we go back 200 years before him, 300 years before him, you have another Ismaili thinker, Abu Yaqub as-Sijistani, and Jake has only read Sijistani in translation, but I'm quoting from a Sijistani book which has not been translated. So I've translated this, and Jake is free to ask his debate team to help him read the Arabic text. I know you have a debate team of some people who know Arabic, so you should lean on them. So grab this text. Now here's what it says. So Sijistani says, and this was in my debate slide. So Jake has been ignoring this quote for the past month and keeps telling people that I'm lying about what Sijistani believes. But here's what Sijistani believes. So he says, the Creator's will is undivided. Okay, so it's completely unitary. And while the will of a creature decides between alternatives, whoever describes the will of God as that which deliberates among alternatives has ascribed incapacity and deficiency to God. So here is a denial of libertarian free will for God. God does not decide among alternatives. Then Sijistani goes on, God's will is pure goodness with the manifestation of wisdom. God does not decide among opposing alternatives, but rather God's will is united with what he wills. Right? So God's will is an act that's united with its product, the first intellect. And God's will is a perfect will with a single position. So here what you have from Abu Yaqub as-Sijistani, he does believe God creates by will, but God's will is just one. It could not be any other way. There were no options that God chose from, and then he picked this. So this is what I would call a modally necessary divine will that the Ismailis affirm. And no, I did not lie in the debate, Jake. I did not lie. And for you to accuse me of lying is a form of defamation and unethical on your part. So I just wanted to make that clarification. I'll probably clip what I just said and sort of just release it, but I just thought I'd take the opportunity. But let's move on now to the second topic that we wanted to just go through. So I'll begin with a clip, and then Bo, we can unpack the clip. So there's this issue of, I said this in the debate, I said that the Aseity Creed appeals to mystery because it says things about God that are logically contradictory to the concept of God as an eternal, necessary being. And that the way that they try to escape the logical contradiction is by appealing to mystery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a clip from the debate where Jake makes a bunch of affirmations about God, which he takes to be the Aseity Creed. We can listen to it. And the only way he's going to, it's two clips I'm playing. So I'm beginning with this. This is from Rebuttal 1 of Jake, where Jake is going to state what he labels as the Aseity belief. And as you listen, you'll notice that these statements completely contradict the rational concept of God that Jake and his podcast have affirmed on other occasions, right? They say God is necessary, eternal, unlimited, and so on. So now he's not physical, but here's what Jake affirms as part of the creed.
Believe that Allah constricts, expands, rejoices, loves, dislikes, becomes pleased, becomes angry, and abhors. He has two hands, and both of his hands are right. The hearts of his servants are between two of his fingers, and he is in the direction of Ulu. And he is established on the throne and is encompassing. The Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam approved the belief of the girl when he asked her, "Where is Allah?" And she pointed to the heavens. The attribute of istiwa must be acknowledged without reinterpretation or ta'wil. It is the settling of his Aseity that above the throne, not in the form of sitting and touching as the corporealists and Karamites have said, not in the form of high status and greatness as the Ash'aris have said, and not in the form of seizing as the Mu'tazila have said. So I don't know where you're getting this idea, but this sounds like Aseity Creed to me, not this garbage that we just heard for the past 20 minutes.
All right. So, I mean, take note of what he said, okay? He said God has two hands, God has two fingers, God is on the throne. He said
Yeah.
God's Aseity is above the throne. Aseity means the divine essence. Where is Allah? He said the correct answer is God is above, toward, like in the direction of the sky. So these are all anthropomorphic affirmations that the Athari / Salafis make. The Salafis actually will translate these into English as you heard them. The Atharis might not. So then the question is, how do you justify this? So I have another clip to play before we go to the analysis. So when they are pressed on this, right? When you ask them, when you ask them about this, how do they deal with this, right? So here's another clip where this is from me cross-examining Jake, where I bring this up. Now, look, this has been edited for for comedic effect. I think quite rightly, though. Okay, so somebody has sort of added some special effects to sort of get the point across.
Of Allah's throne, to point me in the direction of Allah's throne.
Yes, we can point to it. Alhamdulillah, just as Abdul Qadir al-Jilani stated earlier when he quoted the hadith, which you also mentioned, with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, approved the belief of the girl when he asked her, where is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And she pointed to the heavens.
Can you point where is Allah right now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, can you do it with your finger?
Yeah, we point up.
Okay, so Allah is up. Okay. Allah
Yes, on the throne. Yes,
okay, is the throne below Allah?
No, I didn't say that. The throne is
I'm
not.
asking you.
No, the throne is not. I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above the throne. This is what I said.
Is the throne below Allah?
Yes.
The throne is below Allah.
I just said that, yeah.
Okay.
So notice, I mean, how many contradictions we're getting, right? So first, Allah is up. He's like that way.
Yeah.
I don't know how you say an infinite, eternal, immaterial God could be in any direction, but okay.
In this direction.
And then I asked him, okay, so is the throne below God? First he said no.
Yeah. And then he's just like, yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah.
The
Like
lowest heaven below the throne?
Is the lowest heaven below the throne? Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Would you?
Now this is funny, but this is how they imagine the cosmos, okay? Like in, medieval era. They did think the lowest heaven is the throne is at the top sphere, and so this is not an exaggeration.
Affirm that Allah, for the hadith, descends every night to the lowest heaven?
Yes, I affirm nuzul because it's mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet.
So nuzul means to come down, right? So the hadith says that God descends. The Arabic is yanzilu. That's the present tense conjugation of God comes down every night. So there's a hadith that they accept that. So I'm asking him, Jake, do you accept that the hadith says God descends to the lowest heaven? So he says, yes, I accept.
Okay, so then you affirm that Allah descends from above the throne to below the throne?
He never leaves the throne.
I mean, okay, contradiction again.
how does that work?
Yes, it's a real descent of nuzul, which is mentioned in the text.
Okay, what's the meaning of a descent here? Because descent means to go from above to below. So what does nuzul mean?
Yes, we understand it in the plain meaning, which is mentioned in the hadith. If I had it in front of me, I can read it, but it's very clear. I think everybody...
It is very clear. Like, it's clear that it means you go down.
Yeah, but they affirm the apparent meaning. So yeah, he says everybody knows what descent means. Okay, it means to come down. Okay.
So you affirm that Allah descends from above the throne to the lowest heaven below the throne?
Without entering his creation, yes.
Okay, but
again, now what does that even mean? Another contradiction, right? Like he descends, but not.
The lowest heaven is within the creation. So exactly. How do you get there without entering the creation?
Did I mention anything about movement?
So now he says that God doesn't move. He descends according to the
doesn't move.
well-known meaning, but he doesn't move.
Well, you said everybody knows. Okay, what is the meaning of descend that everybody knows?
I just explained it to you.
So
No, he did not explain
Yeah,
it to us.
he didn't.
That's why we're asking.
He just said, I affirm the
Fortunately,
meaning.
that's time, even though it's discussion.
you said let him answer the question.
You can have 20 seconds, Jake, if you'd like.
Explain it again. What's the meaning of nuzul that everybody knows?
Yeah, so I explained it, and Ibn Taymiyyah, which you said that I couldn't appeal to, which I don't know why. All I told you was I don't agree with him on every single position, and that's certainly fine. But when it comes to the usul, I agree with him. And the fact of the matter is, he explains this. He talks even about the spirit coming down and the angels and this type of so-called movement, which we cannot really understand. And he compares that to the nuzul or descent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says the difference in that is exponentially greater. Therefore, we cannot understand the kayfiyah. We don't have enough knowledge on it. We stick to the text and what it says, and we don't dwell on the kayfiyah.
Thank you. Just like we can't understand the kayfiyah of Trinity. Thank you very much.
All right. Now again, this I didn't make the video. This was added by someone, but I think the point is made here. Like, so what we just saw. Bo, tell us. Like, I said this is an appeal to mystery.
Yeah.
To me, it's very clear. There's a contradiction being affirmed at several levels. There's an ontological contradiction. Then there's a contradiction about language. It's descend, but it's not descend. And then we don't know how. So what is this
Right.
Mysterianism? And Bo, is that the same thing as me saying, like, if I said God is the originator of everything ex nihilo, right? But I don't know how God creates. Like, we don't know how God creates. Is that Mysterianism the same as what these Salafi Athari types do?
No, I don't think so. So I think what you're talking about is just sort of acknowledging that there are some limitations to what we know about God, right? We're finite and he's infinite, and there's certain things we don't understand. Do you want to share my slides again here? So I put a few together about this. This is something I thought, was very interesting. So, Jake's appeal to mystery versus Trinitarian appeals to mystery. And as I understand it, there's a whole sort of school of thought that says, well, these are different, though, because we're not appealing to mystery to kind of get out of a contradiction. But I think it's actually exactly what happens in the literature about the Trinity. So Dale Tuggy has done a ton of work on the Trinity. He's actually a Unitarian, so he's not a Trinitarian, and he's described two different senses of what he calls Mysterianism, positive Mysterianism and negative Mysterianism. So positive Mysterianism basically affirms all of these propositions about the Trinity or whatever that are an apparent contradiction. And then what the positive Mysterian does is he says, yes, this is apparently contradictory, but somehow it's not really a contradiction. It's only an apparent contradiction. But I don't know how it's not a contradiction. Or maybe it's a contradiction, but somehow contradictions can be true. And I don't know how, right? So a few people who talk about this, Peter Vandenwagen at one point kind of mentions this, that, in physics, people say light is a wave and it's a particle, and those seem like they can't really both be true, but somehow they are, and we don't really know how. So, and even physicists will tell you this, like, you can derive contradictions from, I think it's like quantum gravity and relativity theory or something. And so they're trying to kind of figure out, and they haven't got it figured out yet. Well, so that's what the positive Mysterian says about the Trinity. And James Anderson, if you're interested, has a book called Paradox in Christian Theology, where he goes into great detail on this. And he talks about what he calls a makruh, which is a merely apparent contradiction resulting from an unarticulated equivocation. So the idea is just sort of there's some kind of equivocation going on, or somehow it looks like a contradiction, but it somehow is not, and it's really true anyway. So that's positive Mysterianism. Negative Mysterianism avoids a contradiction by just leaving certain terms undefined or unanalyzed. So people, in the context of the Trinity, sometimes people just say like God is one in essence, but three in person, but they don't really say what that means. So it's just, there's no further analysis of what those are supposed to mean or something like that. And so that avoids a logical contradiction, but the expense is that you've left the content of what you're asserting mysterious, right? Because you've left certain terms undefined. And in his debate with me, Jake, seemed to say, well, God's hands are just attributes. But then his debate with you, he says, yeah, they're hands in the plain meaning. So it looks to me like if you do kind of map this out, I think you do get the same sort of structure that you see when Trinitarian apologists make this move. So he affirmed apparently contradictory sets of claims. So he says God has hands, but he doesn't have concrete parts, right? God has a shin, but he doesn't have concrete parts. He's above the throne, but he doesn't have a spatial location. He descends, but he doesn't move. And then, as I understand it, Salafis want to say they affirm this in the plain meaning, or I don't know if it's all Salafis or what. You can correct me on that. But and they'll say, okay, this is different though from what Trinitarians are doing because we're not trying to just get out of a contradiction. So here's the way I kind of reconstructed this. Sorry, I put this symbolic logic on here because in my debate review, I kind of went through all of that. But you can show this is a contradiction, right? So here's the contradiction as I would analyze it. 1, God has hands. 2, that statement, God has hands, is true according to the apparent meaning of the word hand, right? 3, the apparent meaning of hand includes being a concrete part. 4, God has no concrete parts. Okay, that gets you a strict logical contradiction. And here's what I would say. It seems like authorism is definitely committed to 1, 2, and 4. They're definitely committed to saying God has hands, and that's true in the apparent meaning, but God has no concrete parts. So it looks like they can't get rid of 1, 2, or 4, right? So the question is just, are you going to accept 3? Are you going to accept that the apparent meaning of hand includes having a physical part? And I would say if you do, then you get an apparent contradiction. And it looks like then what you're doing is saying, well, yeah, it's apparently a contradiction, but somehow it's true and I don't know how, right? I think the phrase is bila kaif, right? Like without asking how or without knowing how. So
I think this is Tawhid al-Kaif for the affirm a meaning, but they say we don't know the modality, the howness.
Right, so we don't know how. So
God descends according to the apparent meaning of descend.
Right.
We don't get into the howness at Kaifiyah. That's what Jake was defending in the debate. That would be Salafi authorism. But then you also have a non-Salafi authorism, which I think will do the second Mysterianism, where they'll just refuse to define what hand means. Right?
So you say it's true according to the apparent meaning, but what is the apparent meaning? Well,
they'll probably the non-Salafi authorees will say we don't take the apparent meaning, but we don't know what the meaning is.
Or so then you can
Which
just
I think is the negative one there.
But that would be a form of negative Mysterianism too, is to say, well, we just leave it undefined. So I think there's one sort of group that just doesn't even say it in English, like they'll say it in Arabic. God has a yod.
Yeah.
And we don't know what that means. And so I would say, that's exactly negative Mysterianism, is when you just leave a certain term undefined so that you don't get this contradiction. And then positive Mysterianism is, well, I'll just affirm all of it, and it looks like a contradiction, but I'll just believe that it somehow really isn't, and it's only apparent. And so it looks to me like those are your options. You either put that definition in there, get the apparent contradiction, and say, well, it's merely apparent, and I don't know how to resolve it, but it's just a merely apparent contradiction. Your other option is take that definition out, and you've just left a term undefined. And so that really is just exactly positive and negative Mysterianism. I did put one meme in here, so this is for the topic of, and it seems like that same pattern goes for any of these, right? So God has hands, but not concrete parts. He's above the throne, but he doesn't have a spatial location. Well, if I stick the typical definition of above, it's going to reference a spatial location. Or descends, if I just put the dictionary definition of descend in there, it's going to say we are moving from one, from higher to lower. So again, in either case, you're either going to affirm this kind of standard definition, positive Mysterianism, or you refrain from giving that definition and you give negative Mysterianism. Otherwise, your only other option, right, is to you affirm some definition, but it's not the kind of dictionary definition, right? And my understanding is that would just be considered tawil, which is what they're committed to not doing. So it seems to me like if you're going to say, yeah, we don't do tawil, then you're just exactly in the same position as Trinitarian Mysterians. You're either going positive or negative Mysterian, and it's precisely to avoid the contradiction, right? That is why you're doing it. So to me, it just seems like, yeah, that's not at all different. Now, and there's one of the things that I thought was really enlightening watching this debate is I was like, well, so and I think it's a cop out when Christians do this, but I was like, so why shouldn't I just say, yeah, God is one, but God is three, and I don't know. Yeah, it sounds like a contradiction.
Yeah, we don't know how. You could just say God is one being, three persons, and we don't know how. This is why I brought it up. That I find that when Salafis, Atharis, Neo-Salafis, when they attack the Trinity or the Incarnation, drawing on all this Dale Tuggy academic literature, which is still very rich, but when they do that, I find this to be an unprincipled line of attack.
Yeah.
Because these people, Salafis, Atharis, Neo-Salafis, Neo-Atharis, when their internal conversations, they will all appeal to mystery, either in the first way or the second way. So this is a failure to apply the same logical, rational standard to one's own position that you're using to attack another position. I just find that to be dishonest. It would be like me, as a Shia Ismaili Muslim, I believe in an infallible leadership office called the imamate, as an authority, as a religious authority. So it would be like me attacking a Catholic doctrine of papacy, specifically on the grounds that infallibility is impossible.
No one's infallible.
If I said nobody is infallible, and then I come and say, well, except the person I believe is,
except my guy.
It's just an unprincipled. It's an unprincipled critique. Did you have another slide, or did?
No, that's all. That's all the slides I had.
Let me just follow up on what you just shared. So interestingly, you brought up contradictions, and Bo, are there some Christians who believe in contradictions as being okay instead of Mysterianism?
Oh yeah. So that's another good point. There's a whole. So J.C. Beale, in particular, has written he wrote something called The Contradictory Christ, and he's argued. So he's a logician, and there are these like non-standard forms. Sometimes people call them subclassical forms of logic, where in these systems of logic, it's okay to have certain contradictions. You can kind of tolerate sort of local contradictions, and they don't the contradiction doesn't sort of spread out to the whole system in these specific versions of logic. And so what he's done is said that he's argued that the incarnation is a contradiction. So Christ just has contradictory attributes. He's both changeless and changing. He's eternal and temporal and so forth. And that's just a contradiction. And but he says we should adopt this, kind of non-standard logic where certain contradictions are okay.
So on that topic of this notion of Christian contradictory theology, we have this interesting article.
Yeah.
Let me just share my screen up again. So there's an academic piece by a Muslim academic, a philosopher named Dr. Saf Chaudhry. And what Saf Chaudhry notes is that firstly, he looks at this Salafi Athari theology, right, which says affirms all the descriptions of God found in the Quran and the Hadith according to the apparent meaning, which, by the way, recently Jake recommitted himself to taking the apparent meaning. So you would have to, apparently the Salafi Athari says God literally has a face, he literally has two hands, he literally descends, he literally appears in a form on the day of judgment or prior. The beardless youth with curly hair hadith, if they take that hadith as authentic, they have to affirm it. He literally has eyes, he literally rolls over the throne, and so on. He literally will put his foot in hell to put the fire out. So this is what the Salafi Atharis today believe in. Now, Dr. Chaudhry has written an article called Examining an Islamic Traditionalist Case for Contradictory Theology, and what he says is that this position, the Salafi Athari position, which Jake affirms, that this position does result in a logical contradiction. So he says, to say that God is transcendent, immutable, changeless, infinite, timeless, and eternal, and then to literally state that he descends, sits, speaks, or expresses emotions would be to negate these attributes. It would entail being God temporal, finite, mutable, and passable. So he says in these examples, we have a case of P not P, where you are affirming about God two contradictory propositions. And he asks, how can the traditionalist stance of affirming statements like the above contradictory conclusions be upheld? So you have here a Muslim academic who says straight up Salafi Athari theology is explicitly a contradiction. And his solution, which he offers the Salafi Atharis, is to adopt the Christian kind of contradictory theology that you just mentioned. So whether one chooses to do that or not, well, the point I'm trying to make to Jake and the Salafis is you guys are affirming contradictions. You are doing that. Academics believe you are. And just before Jake attacks my source, because Jake attacked a prior source I used in the debate, because this particular academic I cited in the debate is part of the Nation of Islam. Of course, I cited a peer-reviewed article. But Jake, before you attack the source I'm quoting here, Dr. Chaudhry has appeared as a guest on Jake's own podcast or YouTube show.
Wow.
So Dr. Chaudhry, in his peer-reviewed article, says the Salafi Athari theology, which Jake affirms, is logically contradictory, and the only way is to save that theology is to adopt this Christian form of contradictory theology. So this is the idea that when you have a contradiction, as you said, Bo, an explicit contradiction, and you try to say, well, we don't know how, that is an appeal to mystery. This is very different from what Ismailis do. We affirm that God is the creator of all existence. That statement is not a contradiction. So then when I say that we don't know how God creates, I'm affirming a mystery, but I'm not affirming the mystery to save a contradiction. I have not made a contradictory statement, right? God creates ex nihilo. That's not a contradiction. We don't know how God creates things ex nihilo. That's not a contradiction, and it's not an appeal to a mystery to get rid of a contradiction. So these are like apples.
Yeah, and that seems completely legitimate. Like obviously, there's going to be things about God and how God operates that we can't understand. But yeah, and there's no even apparent contradiction there. Just saying, yeah, God creates ex nihilo, and I don't really know how that works, but God can do that.
Yeah. The last thing then, which we'll just touch on briefly because we've gone a long time, but all of this, the debate that I had with the two debates, Jake versus you, Bo, and Jake versus me, without making this about the person, because you could substitute Jake with probably many of these people. But what this showed me is that the neo-Salafi, neo-Athari Dawa, i.e. this mission of converting people to Islam that is being run by people who profess to be Salafi, Athari, or one or the other. This includes Jake, it includes Muhammad Hijab, it includes people like Mansour and Hashim, EF Dawa and EA Dawa and FC Dawa. There's so many of these YouTube channels that they go around at Speaker's Corner and they have these podcasts like the Thought Adventure podcast. And I notice when they talk to Christians or atheists, these people act like analytic philosophers.
Yeah.
Right. Even though among
also.
Muslims, they say that they are Salafi or they are Athari, but the Salafi and the Athari creed prohibits philosophy and it prohibits philosophical theology as well. But these people break the rules of their own creed, and they use philosophical theology to do dawah, i.e. to sell their brand of Islam to other people, and they bring in contingency arguments. But then when they're on Clubhouse, just in a Muslim-only room, they'll start making these contradictory statements about God. And I thought a good way to contrast what the neo-Salafi dawah does facing the public and what they do when facing other Muslims, where they try to declare as heretics. A good contrast is shown in this little compilation video, which I'm going to play. So what I've simply done here is there's a podcast episode from Thought Adventure podcast where Jake and team are elucidating the concept of God that they hold to atheists. Okay?
Yeah.
So if you take what they say about God when talking to atheists and you contrast that with what Jake affirmed about God in the debate with me, you're going to find that the positions are mutually contradictory. So I'm going to play this and then we'll have to get your commentary and then we'll sort of end on we'll then begin we'll conclude this review. So I'm just going to play this again. This has been put together by the Brethren of Purity. But it's a very revealing clip, right? Because you have a double-faced neo-Salafi, neo-Athari mission going on. They say one thing to speak at Speaker's Corner, they say one thing, but then when you get them in a controlled debate, everything they were hiding under the rug spills out, for everybody. The one reviewer of the debate, an Ibadi Muslim, actually said, so he's neither Shia nor Sunni, and he basically said the debate between myself and Jake was a historic moment because it's the first time in history that the Athari creed has been exposed, dissected, and destroyed, for everybody to see, because you find out what these people actually believe behind the scenes. So let me just play this. So again, any quote from the podcast giving their view of God, including Jake, juxtaposed with Jake's Athari creed, Athari Salafi creed, that he professed against me, another Muslim, in the debate.
Generally non-Muslims, but specifically atheists, their conception of God is like, and I don't want to use this word because obviously it's derogatory, but they think he's like this big man in the sky, isn't it? Yeah. And so this big man in the sky has a particular personality. Yeah.
And we believe that Allah constricts, expands, rejoices, loves, dislikes, becomes pleased, becomes angry, and abhors.
But they think he's like this big man in the sky, isn't it? Yeah. And so this big man in the sky, like Odin is, or Zeus is, or whatever names, Jupiter, whatever they want to use.
And we believe that Allah has two hands, and both of his hands are right. The hearts of his servants are between two of his fingers.
Their conception of God is like, and I don't want to use this word because obviously it's derogatory, but they think he's like this big man in the sky, isn't it? Yeah. And so this big man in the sky has
the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, approved the belief of the girl when he asked her, "Where is Allah?" And she pointed to the heavens.
But like Odin is, or Zeus is, or whatever names, Jupiter, whatever they want to use. What they don't understand is that our conception, Islamic conception of God, is you believe in one creator, necessary being, independent, eternal, and upon which everything else depends upon for their existence.
And we believe that Allah established on the throne. Where is Allah? And she pointed to the heavens. It is the settling of his Aseity that above the throne.
So if you're now going to see a revelation that's going to be sent down from the Creator, if it doesn't fit within something that we've rationally ascertained about the nature of the Creator in terms of the attributes of the Creator, and the things that we can understand from the reality about the Creator, if it doesn't fit within that, then inevitably you're going to discount that as a revelation.
He has two hands, and both of his hands are right. The hearts of his servants are between two of his fingers, and he is in the direction of Ulu. And he is established on the throne. Where is Allah? And she pointed to the heavens.
That is an independent, transcendent, all-powerful, all-knowing being that isn't arbitrarily limited in any capacity.
And we believe that Allah has two hands, and both of his hands are right. The hearts of his servants are between two of his fingers, and he is in the direction of Ulu. And he is established on the throne.
I mean, this goes to what you were saying earlier, Sharif, about God being a man in the sky, and that seems awfully close to what it would entail if there were more than one God, because then there would be different characteristics that are necessitated in order to distinguish between these gods, and all of us are gods, and this God must be not limited arbitrarily. He must be unlimited, because arbitrary limits are a thing through which we identify contingent beings. If something is arbitrarily limited, if it behaves in a particular way, that's part of what a contingent thing is.
We believe that Allah constricts, expands, rejoices, loves, dislikes, becomes pleased, becomes angry, and abhors. He has two hands, and both of his hands are right. The hearts of his servants are between two of his fingers, and he is in the direction of Ulu. And he is established on the throne and is encompassing. The Prophet ﷺ approved the belief of the girl when he asked her, "Where is Allah?" And she pointed to the heavens. This sounds like Aseity creed to me, not this garbage that we just heard.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is literally like clips, right? That you can just find from their own shows. So the point is, this neo-Salafi Dawa, they use philosophy, in the public domain, and then in the intra-Muslim domain, they just take off that mask, and the necessary being has two hands and two fingers, and he's on the throne. His Aseity is over the throne.
But he's not arbitrarily limited in any way, but he can constrict and expand.
I mean, the question I had for you, Bo, is, I mean, are you guys, those of you who debate people like Jake and others in this Dawa, are you aware of what they actually believe? Like, did anybody know this? Like, here they are making logical problem of the Trinity. Yeah. They're talking about being, person, substance, intrinsic, extrinsic. Like, that's your discourse. And yet their discourse is all about God's hand, finger, throne. Yeah. It just seems like a kindergarten level theology versus university level.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was eye-opening to me. So I'll have to say, I didn't really get the extent of this. So I have videos and things. You mentioned Orthodox Shahadat. Like, those guys who run that channel are super into Islamic theology and stuff. So they've been trying to get me to learn more for forever, and I haven't. But this was sort of like, a light sort of went on. I was like, wait, what, Jake? Because I really thought, I felt like, Jake is an intelligent guy, and I was pretty surprised to find that was the creed that he decided to defend, and it made me really question. It's pretty surprising because it really is like what you were saying. I mean, with me. I guess with atheists and other Christians, it's like you put on the rational face, like we're going to really look at this logically and rationally. And, I think there's some problems with this doctrine of the Trinity. And, like, well, what do you think about this argument from contingency? But then, like when he's debating you, it was just like, I'm just going to take this super literalist approach to the Quran that like just it's hard for me. It's hard for me to see how like just a dispassionate, or even not a dispassionate, but just like a search for truth, right? Like gets you like an honest, intellectually honest search for truth gets you to, I think God has two hands and they're both right hands. Like that, and then also he doesn't have any physical parts. Like I mean, I know like his sort of autobiography is like he grew up Catholic and thought, well, the Trinity and incarnation, these things didn't make any sense, and then he read the Quran and thought, oh, this like answers all these questions and whatever. But here it just looks like, well, but now I mean, he's saying things that don't sound like they make any sense. I mean, they, but it just seems like, well, now I'm like emotionally invested in this particular community and whatever. I mean, it seems like, I know he at one point was just like a Quran only, person or whatever. And then decided that had problems with it. And it seems like, yeah, I mean, maybe he kind of had this formative experience with like, I'm just going to read the Quran, and the Quran just by itself, I can make sense of or whatever. But now it seems like he's adopted this particular view that just seems like, sorry, even my cat thinks it's crazy.
even the cat.
Buddy the cat says you have to be Maturidi or something, but not. And yeah, it's another thing that was really odd to me. I mean, so I'll just say this: like, if I ever do decide to become Muslim, it's not going to be authors. It's definitely not going to be that. Like, and it seems odd to me that that you would want to attack like a different form of Islam that. Maybe there's problems with it. Maybe there's things about it he deeply disagrees with, but like it might be attractive to someone who's thinking about converting, right? I mean, I can certainly say for myself, like if I were shopping for a new religion, like that definitely would not be it, because it just sounds like it's just not just like God has. I mean, just saying God has hands is already like, I'm out. Like I'm already off I'm off that train already. But then it's like, oh yeah, he has two hands and they're both right hands, and God doesn't have any arbitrary limitations, and he doesn't have physical parts. And it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. So it seems like it would be, if I were a Muslim, I would not be shooting down other branches of Islam. I would be saying, maybe here's my version of Islam. There are these other versions, I disagree with them, but maybe they make more sense to some people. And I mean, like for example, if if I was doing my Christian dawah on you and I was trying to convert you, and you were like, yeah, this Eastern Orthodoxy thing doesn't make much sense, but maybe Roman Catholicism does, or Southern Baptist or something. I mean, whatever. Like, it seems like that's better. It's better than nothing. I mean, if people wanted to become Ismaili or whatever, it just seems strange to me that it seemed like the craziest. It just seems like the most problematic form of Islam, and like that's the only one that even counts. And I'm not even sure. Like, I mean, I don't know if does he even consider like other branches of Sunni Islam to be okay. I mean, I guess he hasn't like said there.
I mean, he said on Twitter, he actually said something like the Aseity and Maturidi theologies, which are the mainstream Sunni theologies who don't have any of this baggage.
Yeah.
He said they are like irredeemable or irremediable.
Yeah, that's the thing.
And Sunnis got very upset. Like,
yeah.
The one thing about the reaction to the debate is because Jake committed to full out Salafism.
Yeah.
The backlash of the Sunnis has been against him, not against me. right? Like people are like, this is just ridiculous. Like, what is, how can the people don't understand how someone who for an undergraduate level is well versed on some analytic theology literature, and someone who can actually put that stuff into play, debating Christians, they don't understand how the same person commits to the Salafi thing. It just doesn't make any sense.
So that's exactly what didn't make sense to me. I was just like, wait, that's the creed that.
But I think this is a reason why, if you look in the English language, you can't find these Dawa people, these Dawa boys, as I like to call them, these neo-Salafis. They never actually like discuss their creed. They like defend this very general theism, a general monotheism, right, against other forms, whether it's Hindus, Christians, atheists, and they don't really go past that. This debate was unique that it forced the neo-Athari, the neo-Salafi position to come out in the open, so it could be attacked, right? Which otherwise would never happen. Like the academics don't participate in debates. I only participated in this, in like accidental. Yeah, it's a totally accidental circumstance. I was challenged. I did a calculus in my head. Is it better to have a guy who's going to unleash against Ismaili Islam without my intervention, or when I do get an intervention in a controlled environment? And what I notice is that the Salafis do very well in uncontrolled, rowdy environments. Speaker's corner, clubhouse, they yell you out, they shout over you, they don't let you talk. But in a moderated debate, they have their like 45 minutes to make their case. And if that's it, and I get 45 minutes. So I did a calculus in my mind, and I said, no, the moderated debate will be a great opportunity to set the record straight on my position, right? And just attack this other position because I was attacked first. And that's basically the strategy that I did. Like, I did attack his position because there will be no other opportunity to show the intellectual dissonance between what the neo-Atharis, neo-Salafis say in one realm and what they actually believe in another.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. I had a similar thing. I've had a couple of these kind of like unstructured, like conversation debate sort of things. And I felt frequently like I couldn't quite get my points in, so I kind of thought, maybe a structured debate would be better. And I think it was. I think he wasn't too happy with the result, but I think you're right. I mean, there's something about this just kind of talking over people and sort of rhetorical tricks that don't work as well in a controlled, like, formal debate system.
All right. Well, we're past 3 hours. We should probably wrap up. Did you have any final 1 minute thought on the two debates and what you see yourself doing in the future, if not debates, when it comes to your sort of theology? What type of exchanges maybe you'd be interested in doing? I think, for example, what you did in my class was very helpful, where you and two other, Trinitarians sort of showcased your theologies, that people could see the difference. I think that there has been some asks made to me about how does the Islamic Neoplatonism compare to your monarchical Trinity model? They do look similar, sort of structurally in some respects.
In some ways, also, I mean, I will say, that was another thing that I thought was odd. Is I think your position, I could elaborate. We're out of time, but that there's a number of ways in which I think that your position is a stronger one against. I mean, if you're Muslim, you want to have an apologetic against the doctrine of the Trinity. That makes sense. And I think that your position probably has a stronger, certainly has a stronger position, I think, than Jake's does. And that's another reason why I kept kind of puzzling, like, why does he want to shoot this down? It seems like at least an option you'd want to have in your repertoire if you're a Muslim. But I'd be happy to have a talk with you sometime. I have to come back to your class again and all of that. I guess just to kind of wrap up my impressions is my impression is that in the course of the two debates, it seems like he took some very different and contradictory positions on some key points, and it looks to me like maybe that's a symptom of some deeper thing where it's kind of there's a public image that you give to non-Muslims where we're going to be really rationalist and whatever, and then there's like this along with other Muslims I'm going to kind of take that off, and it's very literalist approach to things. Which
well, thank you, Bo. It was great having you as a guest. In my little closing minute, I promised to address something which I didn't get to. So people said, well, what does the word Tawhid mean? So Tawhid is a verbal noun. It doesn't actually mean oneness. It means to unify, to make something one. It's a verbal noun that takes on direct objects. So we actually have some interesting Ismaili texts where they interpret the word Tawhid as a verbal noun. It's an action. And as an action, God is not the object of Tawhid. Nobody is making God one, right? That wouldn't make any sense. God is the very fountain of oneness. So nobody makes God one. So in Ismaili text, what we find is that Tawhid is an action, and it's an action that is performed by the worshiper, where it doesn't mean to make God one, but it means to isolate divinity from creation. It takes on a negative meaning for when a person does Tawhid. What they
conceptually,
you're conceptually divesting everything in creation of the divine nature. So you're just left with God, right? That's what Tawhid means for the creature, and for the Tawhid at the divine level is what God does. God's action of creating the cosmos is an act of Tawhid, because God creates a creation that is numerically one, namely the first intellect. The Tawhid of God is to create the first intellect. And then the Tawhid of the first intellect and everything within creation is to then deny divinity to oneself, to isolate the divinity away, to divest divinity from oneself. So that's what Tawhid from an Ismaili perspective actually means.
That's interesting, because I just keep coming back to, like, if my main thing was Tawhid, and if I was a Muslim, it would be like, it seems like that's the direction to go in. I mean, it just seems to make more sense to me out of the idea of Tawhid,
right,
as I understand it anyway. And so it seems strange to me to be attacking it. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Bo Branson. We hope maybe you'll come back. We can have a sort of more productive, compare, contrast, exchange. People can learn about our respective models, without there being a debate to have winners and losers. But thank you so much. Enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the summer. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Take care.